Imagine falling asleep, not with a head full of thoughts, but with a heart full of peace. Imagine silence so deep it doesn't just quiet the room, it quiets the chaos inside your mind. No more racing thoughts, no more mental arguments, just calm, stillness, healing. But tell the truth, how many nights have you laid in bed, unable to shut your mind off? You replay conversations, you stress about tomorrow, you feel heavy from carrying thoughts that won't let you rest. And the silence of the night? It doesn't help. It makes the noise inside even louder. The way you end your day is just as important as how you start it. Because if you fall asleep in stress, in noise, in emotional tension, then your healing gets postponed. Your energy stays blocked. Your heart stays heavy. But when you fall asleep in peace, in presence, in deep silence, that's when real healing begins. Today, you're going to discover the kind of silence that doesn't just help you sleep, but transforms your life. These aren't just soft sounds or relaxation tips. These are ancient Buddhist teachings that have healed monks for centuries, teachings that can now help you release the noise and finally rest. So get ready, because after this, your nights will never feel the same again. Before we begin, make a promise to yourself. Write in the comments, "Tonight, I choose silence. I choose healing." You won't just be typing words, you'll be sending a message to your mind. It's time to let go. The more you say it, the deeper it goes. So write it now, and let the healing begin. Most people have never truly heard silence, not the silence outside, but the silence within. The kind that doesn't just pause the noise, it ends the war inside the mind. There's a reason the most powerful people in Buddhist history didn't speak unless it mattered. They didn't just talk less. They used silence like a tool, like armor. While the world reacted, they remained still. While others spoke to prove, they spoke through stillness. And in that stillness, they found something the world could never take: peace that doesn't depend on anything external. This silence wasn't weakness, it was power. The kind of power that makes chaos irrelevant. Now let's go deeper. In the early mornings of temple life, before the birds even sing, monks begin their day not with words, but with presence. They don't rush, they don't check phones, they don't fill space with noise. They sit, they walk slowly, they breathe, they observe, and they let silence shape the beginning of their day, not to escape the world, but to anchor themselves before the world begins to pull. Because here's the truth. Chaos doesn't just come from outside, it rises from within. And monks knew this. That's why silence wasn't just a preference, it was their strategy. When chaos tried to pull them into its noise, they responded with stillness, not because they were passive, but because they were focused, because reacting without awareness is how most people lose control over their minds. In monasteries across the world, especially in the Zen, Theravada, and Tibetan traditions, silence is part of daily life, not by accident, but by design. Meals are eaten in silence. Chores are done in silence. Even community walks are performed without a single spoken word. This might seem extreme to someone used to constant conversation, but to the monk, every word has weight. They don't spend it lightly. Every silence is intentional. Every pause is a choice to respond rather than react. In our world, silence is often misread as emptiness, as lack. But in Buddhist wisdom, it's fullness, Silence is where understanding grows. It's where clarity lives. Think of it this way. When a lake is stirred, you see only ripples. You can't see the bottom. But when it settles, when it becomes still, you can finally see through it. The same is true for the mind. Monks knew this, so they didn't react to every ripple. They waited, they watched, and in their waiting, they saw deeper than most ever will. Now let's talk about the modern world, where noise is currency, where attention is stolen, where reaction is rewarded and reflection is ignored. In this kind of chaos, most people are constantly pulled out of themselves, scrolling, arguing, proving, performing. But silence pulls you back. It reminds you of who you are without needing an audience. And this is where the noble use of silence becomes resistance. In times of injustice, for example, monks didn't always shout. They sat. In the face of persecution, many did not argue. They embodied peace. Think of Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize by Martin Luther King Jr. He led silent peace marches. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence was louder than any speech. Because silence, when rooted in deep truth, doesn't weaken your message. It amplifies it. There's a type of strength that comes when you no longer need the last word. When your inner world is so calm, the outer noise can scream, and you stay unmoved. That's not detachment, that's mastery. And it's trained, not gifted. It's built slowly in the quiet hours, the hours when you sit with discomfort and don't reach for distraction, when you hear your fears and don't argue with them, when you feel emotions rising and don't push them down, but don't let them control you either. That's the silent resistance monks practiced. They let the storm pass without becoming the storm. It's easy to react when insulted. It's easy to explain yourself. It's easy to defend. But silence? That takes inner strength. The kind of strength that sees past the moment. Because when you're truly rooted in yourself, you stop negotiating your peace. You stop letting chaos rent space in your mind. You don't run from it. You just no longer feed it. This silence is not withdrawal. It's wisdom. A monk sweeping the floor in silence is not disconnected. He is connected deeper than most people ever are. Every movement becomes a meditation. Every breath becomes a return to presence. In this silence, awareness grows like roots. You begin to see how much of your life has been reaction, not response, noise, not truth, chasing, not arriving. And here's something powerful. True silence reveals the truth about others too. When you stop talking, people reveal themselves. You begin to see how much of human speech is nervous filler, how many lies are told just to avoid a pause, how many arguments are habits, not beliefs. In silence, masks fall, and truth becomes clearer than ever. There are moments in Buddhist practice where even eye contact is avoided, not out of disrespect, but out of deep respect for inner stillness. Because even a glance can pull attention outward. And when a monk is in silence, their attention turns inward completely. Not to obsess, not to analyze, but to witness, without judgment, without narrative, just witness. This witnessing is the beginning of transformation. In chaos, people usually try to regain control by controlling others, controlling situations, or controlling outcomes. But monks go the other way. They give up control and find something deeper, influence over their own response. That's the real power, not in changing the storm, but in becoming the calm within it. You might ask, how can silence heal trauma, pain, grief? Because silence removes the performance. In noise, you wear masks. In silence, the masks fall. You cry without needing words. You feel without interruption. And when the emotion fully expresses without needing a story, you stop recycling it. It moves through, it completes, and healing begins. Stillness becomes the container for what the mind couldn't explain, because not all wounds are meant to be spoken. Some are meant to be held in sacred quiet, like a small bird resting in your hands. No analysis, no labels, just presence. That's why monks don't use silence to escape emotion. They use it to meet it, fully, gently. They sit with fear until fear softens. They sit with anger until anger dissolves. And in that sitting, in that stillness, the emotion is transformed, not by logic, but by space, by not clinging, by not resisting, just by being. This is the noble use of silence in the face of chaos. When the world demands noise, you answer with awareness. When the world offers drama, you offer peace. Not through force, not through preaching, just through presence. A quiet presence that shifts the energy of a room without saying a single word. One of the greatest Buddhist teachings is that silence is a mirror. And when you sit with it long enough, it shows you everything you need to see about the world and about yourself. It's not always pretty, but it's always honest. This is why monks don't just practice silence. They become it. Their steps are quiet, their eyes soft, their speech rare. Not because they lack expression, but because they've refined it, because they don't waste energy trying to be understood by those who aren't listening. They speak when their words serve truth, and fall silent when truth is best served by space. In our chaotic world, we can learn this too, not to become monks, but to become masters of our own inner environment. To learn when silence heals more than speech, when stillness solves more than action, when peace is protected not by defense, but by non-reaction. Silence in Buddhism is not just the absence of talking, it's the presence of something deeper, something sacred. It's a reset, a spiritual cleanse, a chance to step outside the drama and see clearly. And when practiced daily, it changes everything. Not just how you sleep, but how you live. Because once you've tasted real silence, the kind that reaches your bones, you'll never crave noise the same way again. You'll start to notice how loud the world is, how quickly people speak without thinking, how often emotions are thrown like weapons, and you'll choose again and again to return to stillness, not out of fear, but out of knowing. This is where the power is. Silence is not the absence of life, it is the beginning of life fully felt. And tonight, as you drift off to sleep, let this silence surround you, not as a void, but as a sanctuary. Let it clean the noise of the day. Let it untangle the knots in your chest. Let it remind you that even in the middle of chaos, you can be calm, you can be free, you can be whole. Because silence isn't just healing, it's who you really are when the world stops demanding a performance. And just like that, the stillness begins to speak for itself. No words, yet something in you shifts. No conversation, yet everything is understood. Because some of the deepest truths are not meant to be said aloud. They are meant to be felt, in the quiet between sentences, in the pauses people avoid, in the breath that replaces speech. Silence, when chosen with awareness, becomes a form of communication far more powerful than most words could ever be. This is where we begin to uncover what the Buddha truly meant when he spoke not only of right speech, but of right silence. In Buddhist teachings, right speech is one of the elements of the Noble Eightfold Path. It includes speaking truthfully, kindly, and at the right time. But there's a deeper wisdom behind this. Sometimes, the most truthful, kind, and timely response is not a response at all. It's presence. It's quiet compassion. It's the discipline to hold space instead of filling it. Because not everything needs a comment. Not every moment needs advice. And not every emotion needs to be processed out loud. When the Buddha spoke of noble silence, he wasn't talking about being mute or withdrawn. He was teaching a higher level of engagement, one that doesn't depend on language, but on awareness. To practice noble silence is to listen so deeply that words become unnecessary. It's to feel so connected that even in stillness, the heart speaks louder than the mouth. Right silence is what happens when the ego is no longer hungry to be heard. When someone is angry, for example, most people speak back. They defend, explain, correct, or retaliate. But the silence of a wise person becomes a mirror. It reflects the anger without multiplying it. It gives space for the other person's fire to burn out, without adding more fuel. That's not passivity. That's strategic stillness. It's emotional intelligence disguised as quiet. And here's the subtle mastery. Right silence is never used to manipulate. It's not the cold shoulder. It's not passive aggressiveness. It's not withdrawal used as punishment. That's just emotional noise in disguise. Right silence comes from a clear, open place. A place that says, I am here, I see you, but I choose not to engage in harm. It's the most compassionate boundary a person can set. In the suttas, the Buddha would sometimes be asked a complex or confrontational question, and instead of answering, he would remain silent. This was not avoidance. This was transmission. The question was not wrong, but the answer wasn't ready to be received. So he left it in stillness, letting the silence teach what words would have only confused. This is the wisdom most people miss. We are taught that speaking up is strength, that clarity always comes from explanation, that silence means defeat. But in Buddhism, clarity often arrives in the quiet. Strength is found in restraint. And silence, when used skillfully, becomes an act of profound love. Think about it. How many times has speech complicated things that silence could have simplified? The argument that spiraled because of one extra comment. The misunderstanding that grew because both sides refused to pause. The apology that lost its meaning because it came with too many justifications. These are not rare moments, they are daily. But the one who learns to respond with noble silence begins to break these loops. Right silence is not avoidance, it's alignment. It means not speaking when speech would cause more confusion, more suffering, more ego. It's knowing that silence is not empty. It's full of patience, presence, and care. There are moments when a friend opens up with pain, and instead of advice, they need your stillness, not your answers. Just your breath, your attention, your non-interruption. In that moment, your silence tells them, I'm not trying to fix you, I'm just here, fully here. And often, that heals more than any words could. There are moments when anger rises in a conversation, and rather than meeting it with words, you offer space, you breathe, you let the moment pass. That silence becomes a shelter for both of you. And in that quiet space, something softens, something opens. That's right silence. Monks train this not just in meditation halls, but in life, in how they walk, in how they interact. Every silence is chosen, not forced. And this choice reshapes their relationships. It teaches people around them to slow down, to listen, to reflect. Because silence, when anchored in love, invites others into awareness. This is not about becoming silent all the time. It's about learning the rare wisdom of when not speaking is a gift. Sometimes, silence protects the dignity of a person who is struggling. Sometimes, it keeps an argument from turning into a wound. Sometimes, it allows the truth to echo without distortion. And sometimes it simply means you trust the moment enough to let it be. The ego rushes to explain, to correct, to defend its image. But right silence says, I don't need to win this. I don't need to be right. I need to stay aligned. And that becomes a quiet revolution, a rebellion against the noise of the world that always wants the last word. There's a Buddhist phrase, speak only if it improves upon the silence. That's not just poetic, that's practical, because silence in itself is healing. It's rest for the nervous system. It's a space where the mind untangles itself, where emotions dissolve without analysis, where the heart feels safe to be soft again. Speech is important, yes, but only when it serves clarity, when it comes from silence, not from noise. Right speech grows out of right silence, not the other way around. Many practitioners begin to notice over time that the more they meditate, the less they need to talk. Not because they become withdrawn, but because they stop needing to fill space. They become comfortable with presence, with being, with letting the silence hold what words cannot carry. In this space, even daily life changes. You begin to pause before replying. You wait an extra breath. You listen to what's not being said. You feel the weight of your words before releasing them, and that mindfulness creates a ripple. Conversations become cleaner, arguments dissolve before they form, emotions are honored without being leaked onto others. Right. Silence is not silence for silence's sake. It is silence as medicine, silence as clarity, silence as truth. In Zen Buddhism, there is a tradition of answering questions with koans, strange, paradoxical statements that break logical thinking. Sometimes, the most profound answer is no answer at all, just presence, just still eyes, just silence that leaves the questioner facing themselves. Because some questions don't need answers, they need attention. And that's what noble silence really is, radical attention. A form of care so deep it doesn't need to be loud. It holds space without filling it. It welcomes without pressing. It listens without interruption. And in doing so, it teaches by example. When you practice this kind of silence, you start to sense what others need, not just what they say. You feel when someone needs space instead of advice. You know when holding back is the kindest choice. You understand that real connection doesn't always require a voice. This is not taught in school. It's rarely praised in society, but it is sacred in Buddhist practice. And once it's learned, it becomes a lifelong companion, because silence, right silence, becomes your anchor in the storm. Your answer when words are not enough. Your gift when presence matters more than performance. It's the way of the wise, the way of the monk, the way of the awakened heart. And now that you've felt it, even just in words, you'll begin to notice it more. In yourself, in others, in the spaces between conversations, in the choices you make every day. To speak or not to speak. To fill or to hold. To react or to rest. You'll start to ask, will this improve the silence? And when the answer is no, you'll smile and stay quiet. That is right silence. And once the words have settled, once the air grows still after right silence has done its quiet work, something even deeper begins to emerge. Something beyond language, beyond listening, beyond the presence of any sound at all. It's not just the absence of speech. It's the presence of emptiness, a vast, peaceful spaciousness that holds everything without holding on. A silence so full it carries healing in its emptiness. This is where truth lives, not in words, not in explanations, but in what remains when all that is false finally falls away. This is the sound of emptiness, not a void, not a blank, but a subtle resonance that speaks without a voice. The mind doesn't know how to grasp it, but the heart recognizes it immediately. It's what the Buddha pointed to every time he sat without speaking, every time he answered a question with stillness instead of doctrine. It's what every deep meditation touches, the kind of silence that's not just quiet, but alive. Most people think of emptiness as loss, as nothingness, but in Buddhism, shunyata, emptiness, is the doorway to freedom. Not because it erases life, but because it erases illusion. Emptiness is not the absence of meaning. It is the absence of distortion, of ego, of attachment, of noise. It's what remains when all the stories fall silent and the raw, untouched presence of life is revealed. This is where healing happens. Because suffering is not just pain, it's the meaning we add to pain. It's the commentary, the judgment, the resistance. The mind says, this shouldn't be happening, and that voice multiplies the wound. But in the sound of emptiness, that voice fades, the judgment fades, and pain becomes just sensation. Fear becomes just energy. Grief becomes just movement, all held in a space that needs no interpretation, just being. Monks didn't just meditate to quiet the mind. They meditated to return to emptiness, to return to what they truly are before identity, before memory, before roles. In the depth of stillness, they found that nothing was missing, not because they gained something, but because the illusion of lack dissolved. And this is why the sound of emptiness heals. It doesn't fix the self. It shows there is no fixed self to begin with. Stillness reveals what noise distorts. Words try to define, try to label, try to own. But emptiness allows. It watches without interruption. It lets experience pass without freezing it in place. And that's why it's so hard for the thinking mind to accept, because it cannot control emptiness. It cannot categorize it. But the heart The heart knows this place well. It's been longing for it all along. Healing through emptiness doesn't come from doing more. It comes from undoing, from letting go of the effort to explain, to solve, to become. In this space, there is no becoming, only being, no fixing, only unfolding. And strangely, this is where true change occurs. Not because we try to change, but because we stop resisting what is. That quiet surrender is not weakness. It's power rooted in peace. When a person touches emptiness, they stop needing proof. They stop needing permission. They stop needing to be understood. Because the one who needed all those things, the constructed self, starts to dissolve, and what's left is soft awareness, spacious kindness. The kind of presence that doesn't ask to be seen, it just is. Many Buddhist teachers speak of listening to silence, not metaphorically, but actually. Because silence has texture. Silence has tone. It holds subtle frequencies that the ordinary mind misses. But when awareness deepens, those frequencies begin to emerge. A sense of something vast, unmoving, gentle, but undeniably present. This is not imagination, it's direct experience. And once known, it becomes more comforting than any mantra, more stabilizing than any explanation. People chase healing in books, in talks, in techniques, but the greatest healer in Buddhism has always been this emptiness, the sound of stillness, the sacred pause that lets the body relax, the breath return, the stories melt. Because every nervous system craves rest, but not just sleep, silence, a silence that holds, not silences, that nourishes, not ignores. This is why monks can sit for hours without speaking, without moving, without needing, because they are not doing nothing, they are resting in everything, in the totality that has no name, in the groundless space that holds the entire universe and yet weighs nothing. This stillness is not a break from life, it is life in its purest form. Most people fill their time because they fear emptiness. Silence makes them anxious. Stillness makes them restless. But this is not because silence is uncomfortable. It's because in silence, everything suppressed starts to rise. And the truth is, that's the beginning of healing, not the problem. Because when you finally sit still, the noise inside doesn't get louder, it gets noticed, and only what is noticed can be released. That is the gift of the sound of emptiness. It doesn't push anything away, it invites it all in. And by doing nothing, it does what no effort can. It reveals what's always been whole. This is not a concept, it's a practice. To sit without needing entertainment, to walk without needing destination, to breathe without needing control, to let the moment pass through without holding it, chasing it, or naming it. Each of these is an invitation into the sound of emptiness, and each one deepens your connection to a self that is not small, not loud, not insecure, but vast and quiet and free. In Tibetan Buddhism, some teachers say that silence is the speech of the awakened, because when the mind becomes truly clear, there's nothing left to explain. Just like the sky doesn't need to explain the clouds, the awakened mind doesn't need to explain the thoughts. It sees them rise, drift, and dissolve without clinging. And in that letting go, everything becomes lighter. the pain, the past, even the identity you used to carry so tightly. So many people look for peace by trying to fix their minds, but the sound of emptiness doesn't fix. It dissolves. It makes the tight spaces inside you spacious. It makes your rigid beliefs soften. It makes your anxious patterns slow down, not because you wrestled with them, but because you stopped feeding them. You gave them space to leave. Healing is not always bright. Sometimes it's quiet, soft, invisible. Sometimes the greatest healing comes in a moment when you sit alone, without distraction, and feel the whole sky inside your chest. That is the sound of emptiness. Not the sound of being alone, but the sound of being everything and nothing at once. This is why true healing sounds like nothing. Because the deepest wounds don't need noise. They need space. And the deepest truths don't shout. They whisper. They arrive when you stop searching. When the surface finally stills. And in that stillness, a knowing arises. Not learned, not earned, just there, silent, clear, undeniable. And it says, you don't have to chase peace. You only have to stop disturbing it. This is the gift the Buddha passed down through silence, through presence, through his still gaze and his empty hands. He didn't point to a belief. He pointed to a state anyone can touch. Not later, not after enlightenment, but now, in the quiet, in the breath, in the gentle unfolding of this very moment. And the more you return to this emptiness, the more you begin to trust it. At first, it may feel unfamiliar, but soon it feels like home. Because it is. It's the home underneath all the noise, the constant thoughts, the shifting emotions. It's always been there, quietly waiting for you to listen, not with ears, but with presence. There is a quiet law unfolding beneath every moment, every breath, every intention, even the ones that are never spoken aloud. Not everything that shapes life is visible. Not every consequence announces itself with noise. Some karmas begin in silence, and some karmas are undone in silence too. While words and actions shape the world outside, unspoken thoughts and silent choices leave deep impressions inside, and those impressions ripple through lifetimes. After silence has revealed the truth of emptiness, after the noise has fallen and presence has become steady, something deeper begins to rise. A realization that even in stillness, nothing is ever neutral. The mind is always planting seeds. Even in silence, karma is echoing. In Buddhism, karma is not punishment. It's not fate. It's the law of cause and effect. What you think, what you feel, what you intend, these are all seeds. Some grow quickly, some stay hidden for years, but all of them bloom sooner or later. And this blooming doesn't depend on words alone. Even the thoughts you bury, the feelings you suppress, the silent reactions you never speak aloud, they shape your inner landscape. This is the echo of karma in silence. There's a common belief that silence means nothing is happening, that if you don't act, you don't create karma. But that's not how it works. Karma responds not just to action, but to intention, to the movement of the heart, to the energy behind the stillness. A mind that sits quietly but brews resentment is not in noble silence, it's in karmic fermentation. And a mind that sits quietly but radiates compassion even without speaking, is creating a new field of peace around it. This is why inner silence is not just absence, it's transformation. Not all silence is equal. There's silence that suppresses and silence that purifies. The difference is awareness. When monks sit in deep meditation, they are not just calming the surface of the mind, they are observing karma unfold. Thoughts rise like bubbles, feelings appear, try to take hold, and dissolve. And if they're watched without attachment, without judgment, without feeding them, they pass. And in passing, they lose their grip. The karmic loop is broken, not by force, but by seeing. Because karma is not just in action, it's in reaction. The way you meet your own thoughts, the way you meet your emotions, that meeting either reinforces the loop or rewrites it. Take anger, for example. If it rises and you act on it, the loop strengthens. If it rises and you suppress it, it festers underground. But if it rises and you see it clearly, feel it fully, without identifying with it, it begins to fade. That fading is karmic healing. That space you gave it without reaction is the silence that ends the cycle. Every time you bring awareness into silence, you open space for karmic echoes to be heard. They're not loud, but they're there. The silent expectations, the unspoken blame, the habitual roles you play without questioning. These are all karmic imprints repeating themselves until they're seen, and seeing them from stillness changes everything. In daily life, people often speak with restraint, but think with violence. They smile outwardly, but curse inwardly. They obey socially, but rebel mentally. And all of this, though silent, has a karmic cost. Because intention does not need volume to shape the future. It only needs focus. And when focus turns toward fear, anger, judgment, it strengthens those patterns. But when it turns toward compassion, patience, equanimity, those seeds grow instead. The echo of karma in silence teaches one thing clearly. Your inner dialogue is your destiny. Not because the world hears it, but because you do. Because it becomes the atmosphere you live in. A person who constantly thinks with criticism, even silently, is living inside a storm. A person who thinks with grace is already living in the calm that others are still seeking. This is why Buddhist practice emphasizes mindfulness, even in thought. It's not about suppressing bad thoughts or forcing positive ones. It's about becoming aware of the mind's movements, without letting them define you. Watching, not clinging. Listening, not reacting. In that awareness, karmic imprints lose power. And there's another layer to this. Some karma is ancestral, passed down in silence, not spoken, but absorbed. Family fears, cultural shame, collective trauma. These aren't shouted. They're whispered through generations. They settle quietly into posture, habits, expectations, and unless they're met with conscious stillness, they continue undisturbed. But silence breaks patterns too. When you sit still long enough, the noise of your lineage rises, the beliefs you inherited, the emotional loops you didn't choose, the roles you were expected to play. And when those rise and you don't perform them, don't believe them, don't run from them, you become the end of that loop. You become the one who sees, and the one who sees becomes free. This is the sacred power of inner silence. It doesn't just help you feel better, It helps you stop repeating what never belonged to you. It gives you a pause long enough to choose a new direction, to act with intention instead of momentum, to live from wisdom instead of habit. In the Tibetan tradition, there are practices where a practitioner visualizes karmic seeds being burned away by the heat of awareness. Not literally, but energetically. Each time the mind stays present with an old story without feeding it, the story loses its roots. This is not poetic. It's precise. It's the science of attention. Where attention goes, energy flows. So if you give silent attention to pain, not through resistance, but through curiosity, you change its structure. You change your relationship to it. And because karma is always relational, that change is everything. You begin to see that silence is not neutral. It's a turning point. A silent breath before speaking can stop a lie from becoming real. A silent walk after conflict can stop you from saying something you'd regret. A silent hour each day can reveal truths about yourself that years of talking never uncovered. These aren't just soft skills, they are spiritual technologies, simple, subtle, but powerful enough to shift lifetimes. The echo of karma in silence also works on others. When you hold space for someone without judgment, even without words, you give them a place to unfold differently. Your presence becomes a refuge, not because of what you say, but because of what you don't say. You don't rush, you don't fix, you don't control, you just are. And in that, they can meet themselves without fear. This is why monks can sit with suffering people and bring peace without speaking. Because peace isn't always something you give. Sometimes it's something you stop taking away. And what takes peace away fastest is unconscious reaction. What restores it is conscious presence, silent, steady, loving. Silence is also where karmic insight grows. The more still you become, the more you see the loops. How the same thought leads to the same reaction. How the same reaction creates the same pain. How the same pain reinforces the same belief. And you start to realize you were never cursed. You were just repeating a script. And now you can stop. But stopping doesn't mean escaping. It means staying, long enough to see through the illusion, long enough to feel the pain without becoming it, long enough to see that every karma needs your participation to survive. And when you stop participating, silently, consciously, the loop unwinds. This is the deeper silence. Not just the silence of lips, but the silence of inner rebellion. The silence that says, I will no longer obey the voice of fear. I will no longer react out of habit. I will no longer believe the thought just because it's loud. I will watch. I will breathe. I will be still. And in that stillness, I will remember who I am before the story. This kind of silence doesn't erase karma. It transforms it. It doesn't skip the lesson. It completes it. Because karma is not a prison, it's a teacher. And when the lesson is received, the pattern ends. You don't need to speak your healing into existence. Sometimes you only need to stop interrupting it. Let the old thoughts pass. Let the silence hold them. Let awareness do what explanation never could. Because in the quiet, you'll hear something ancient, a knowing beyond thought, a truth that needs no defense. It whispers through every breath. Karma is not the end. Presence is the exit. After karma begins to lose its grip in silence, something unexpected appears in the space it leaves behind. A presence that does not speak, does not judge, and does not seek control. It watches, quietly, constantly, without interruption, not the mind, not the voice in the head, but something behind it, the quiet witness. This is the turning point in Buddhist practice. Not simply calming thoughts, not resisting them, but stepping back far enough to see that none of them are truly who you are. That awareness can exist without being caught in what it sees. And this shift from identification to observation is one of the most powerful transformations a human being can experience. It is not loud, it does not demand attention, but it changes everything. To become the quiet witness is to leave behind the need to fix every emotion, finish every story, or win every mental argument. It is the beginning of spiritual clarity, not because the thoughts stop, but because they no longer stick. Like clouds passing in a vast sky, they move, they change, and they dissolve, and the sky remains untouched. Most people spend their lives inside the mind's theater. They sit in the front row of every thought, reacting to every scene, believing every storyline. But the Buddhist path offers a different seat, behind the projector, where you no longer follow the story. You observe it. You begin to see the thought, the feeling, the sensation, not as me or mine, but simply as passing content in awareness. This may sound simple, but it requires deep practice. Because the habit of identification is strong, it begins in childhood. We are trained to believe that what we think is what we are, that what we feel defines our identity. But the quiet witness watches the thought and knows, this is just a thought. It feels the emotion and says, this is just energy. It sits with discomfort and understands, this too will pass. And that gap between experience and reaction, that's the space where freedom lives. In that space, the brain begins to change. Modern neuroscience confirms what ancient monks discovered long ago. Watching without reacting rewires the mind. The more you observe without clinging, the more the brain unlearns its automatic responses. The amygdala, responsible for fear and reactivity, begins to quiet. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for awareness and regulation, strengthens. Over time, you stop reacting because there is nothing inside you that needs defending. Peace is not the absence of emotion, it is the absence of entanglement. Becoming the quiet witness doesn't mean becoming distant. It means becoming present without being pulled. You can be fully in a moment without becoming lost in it. You can experience sadness without drowning in it. You can feel anger without acting from it. This is not repression. It is reverence for clarity. Monks spend years training this way of seeing. They walk, sit, eat and breathe with awareness turned inward, not to escape the world, but to anchor themselves so deeply in presence that the world no longer shakes them. Every act becomes a meditation. Every moment becomes a mirror. They don't control life, they see it clearly, and in that clarity, control becomes unnecessary. There is no need to push away a thought when you are not trying to protect a self from it. There is no need to fear emotion when you are not fused with it. The quiet witness does not choose denial. It chooses neutrality. It doesn't say, this is good or this is bad. It simply says, this is here. And that simple noticing, repeated again and again, begins to dissolve the illusion of a fixed self. You start to see that what you called I is a changing stream of experience. Thoughts rise and fall, emotions come and go, even your body changes, but the witnessing presence remains, still, steady, silent. This is the foundation of equanimity. Not a dull, indifferent peace, but a radiant calm that comes from knowing that you are not what moves. You are what watches the movement. In daily life, this practice creates a profound shift. Stress still visits, but it doesn't stay. Triggers still happen, but they don't control. You still feel, but you are no longer owned by your feelings. Conversations become cleaner. Decisions become clearer. You no longer need to prove anything because you are no longer defending an illusion. To cultivate this witnessing mind, start where you are. Right now, notice the breath. Don't change it. Just notice it. Then notice the thought that says, this is boring, or I'm not doing it right. Don't fight the thought. Don't believe it either. Just watch it rise, exist, and fade. This is the practice. With time, you'll begin to see that you are not just practicing awareness. You are awareness. The thoughts are like weather. You are the sky. And once this truth is known, not just understood but felt, the relationship to life softens. There is less grasping, less pushing, less rushing, because you begin to trust that nothing needs to be forced, that everything rises and passes in its own time. And your job is not to control the flow. It is to watch with care and act from clarity. This witnessing presence doesn't need to be wise. It is wisdom itself, not the kind that comes from knowing facts, but the kind that comes from seeing without distortion. When you look at the world through the eyes of the witness, you stop reacting to the surface and start responding from depth. Even the body responds differently. Breath slows, muscles loosen, heartbeat steadies, because the nervous system is no longer caught in constant protection mode. It has learned to trust silence, to rest in stillness, to find safety not in certainty, but in presence. The quiet witness is not something you become, it is something you remember. It was there before the mind got loud, before the world taught you to react. It has always been there, watching quietly, waiting patiently for you to return. And when you do return, when you sit in that space behind the noise, you find something priceless. Peace that doesn't depend on outcomes. Peace that isn't based on getting what you want, but on knowing you are already whole. This is what the Buddha practiced under the Bodhi tree. Not fighting thought, not chasing bliss, just watching, for hours, for days, for weeks, until the mind exhausted itself, until what remained was presence, pure and clear. That presence is not special, it's not rare, it's right here, always, hidden beneath layers of thinking, drama, noise, but still there. And when you give yourself to silence, not as escape, but as inquiry, you find it again. You find yourself not in thought, but in watching thought. That's where the shift happens. That's when suffering begins to end. Not because life gets easier, but because your relationship to it changes. You stop trying to fix every moment. You start witnessing it. You stop believing every thought. You start watching it. You stop chasing peace. You realize you are peace when nothing else is being added. And in that realization, the world feels new. Not because it changes, but because you're no longer reacting from habit. You're responding from wholeness. So sit with that, breathe with that, let it deepen, let it grow. And when the quiet witness is no longer just a concept, but a felt reality, when the observer has become steadier than the emotions it observes, a new kind of silence begins to call. Not just the silence between thoughts, not just the pause before a reaction, but a silence that is chosen fully, intentionally, as a way of living, as a sacred vow. This is where Muna begins, not as absence of sound, but as a path of healing. Mauna is the Sanskrit word for silence, but it does not simply mean being quiet. It refers to a disciplined, conscious silence that purifies the mind, resets the nervous system, and severs the mental loops that feed anxiety and emotional addiction. It's not something done out of obligation. It's taken as a vow, with reverence, with trust, and with the clear understanding that silence is not empty. It is medicine. The ancient seekers who took the vow of Muna weren't just avoiding noise. They were dissolving the self, who needed to speak, to defend, to explain, to constantly narrate experience. They were making space for something deeper to rise. Truth without decoration, peace without condition, and healing without effort. Because when words fall away, the self that depends on them starts to loosen its grip. The modern world doesn't reward silence. It rewards performance, constant talking, fast opinions, instant responses. People are trained to speak even before they've fully felt, to reply before they've fully listened, to label what they barely understand. And over time, this habit creates noise, not just outside, but inside. The mind becomes addicted to reacting, to explaining, to being heard, even when nothing real is being said. Muna breaks this cycle. It offers a reset so rare that most never experience it. Not just a digital detox, not just a quiet room, but a total shift in inner posture. Choosing not to speak for a period of time, an hour, a day, a week, even longer, not as punishment, but as permission. Permission to come back to center, to reclaim energy lost in useless dialogue, to hear what's actually underneath all the mental noise. This vow is not about being mysterious or aloof. It's not about withdrawing from people. It's about returning to alignment. It's about noticing how much of what we say is driven by discomfort, not clarity. Muna reveals this. It reveals the nervous impulse to fill space, to explain emotions as they're being felt, to respond automatically just to avoid silence in a room. And when the vow is held, that impulse is seen, and slowly it fades. The result? The mind gets quiet. But more than that, it gets light. Thoughts slow. Emotions soften. And in that softening, patterns start to break. The old reactions that once felt automatic now seem unnecessary. The stories that once demanded attention now pass like wind, because when you stop feeding them with words, they lose their momentum. Muna also reveals emotional dependencies, not on people, but on certain feelings. The craving to be understood, the habit of venting to release tension, the attachment to being validated through conversation. These are forms of emotional addiction, And when speaking stops, they surface. They rise like waves looking for an outlet. But with silence held, those waves crash on the shore of awareness and dissolve. Anxiety is often fueled by mental rehearsal, by imagined conversations, by preparing responses before anything happens. When you speak less, you think less about speaking. When you think less about speaking, your brain stops rehearsing future fear scenarios. And when the future stops consuming the present, anxiety has nothing left to feed on. This is why monks take temporary or lifelong vows of silence, not to cut themselves off from the world, but to reconnect with it without interference. Muna is not isolation, it's purification. It's tuning the mind back to its original state, open, quiet, clear, without needing to label every experience or narrate every feeling. When you practice Muna, something subtle begins to shift. You become more intentional with your energy. You begin to ask, does this need to be said? Is this thought even mine? What would happen if I let this feeling pass without giving it a voice? These questions create space, and in that space, peace returns. There are modern ways to practice Muna, even in a busy life. You can take 1 hour a day where you don't speak. No texting, no emails, just presence. Or you can take a full day each week where you don't explain yourself. You simply act from silence. You let your energy speak. You let your breath speak. And through this, you begin to see how much of communication is noise pretending to be necessary. As the vow deepens, you start to notice your speech in new ways. Not just what you say, but how it affects your energy. You notice when your words are rooted in insecurity, when your voice rises just to be heard, when your laughter is just a defense, and once you see it, you no longer need it. The patterns fall away, not through force, but through clarity. Muna teaches you to hold your truth quietly, to carry your presence like a flame that doesn't flicker just because the world gets loud. It teaches you to become a refuge for yourself, where nothing needs to be said in order to be real, where emotions are felt fully without broadcasting, where healing happens not through expression but through containment. There's a deep strength in silence that no performance can replace, a kind of dignity that arises when you no longer need to be the loudest, the smartest, or the most interesting in the room. You begin to enjoy your own company. You begin to trust your own rhythm. You begin to speak only when speaking adds peace. This vow also brings you closer to presence. When speaking pauses, awareness sharpens. Small things become visible again. The sound of your own footsteps, the texture of your breath, the rise and fall of emotions without commentary. You start to live directly, not through narration. Experience becomes cleaner, more vivid, and the mind becomes simpler. Many spiritual teachers describe a moment in their silence practice when the identity they used to carry, the one made of stories, names, accomplishments, simply dropped. Not with force, but with quiet clarity, because they saw that none of it was required for presence to exist. None of it was required to feel alive. Muna gives access to this realization, not by adding anything, but by removing the noise that covers it. It's not a suppression of truth. It's a resting in truth so pure it doesn't need words. A truth that can be known only when the mind has emptied its opinions and the heart has emptied its defenses. For someone living in constant stimulation, this vow may feel challenging, but that challenge is the very reason it works, because it interrupts the cycle of reaction. It cuts the thread of unconscious behavior, and it does so gently. There's no punishment in Muna, no force, just a return to the place where life is enough as it is, without being named, shared, or explained. And perhaps most importantly, Muna deepens compassion. Not the kind that's performed with words, but the kind that's felt in silence. The kind that listens completely, holds space without advice, and radiates calm even when everything around is loud. This compassion does not need to be seen. It simply is. And in this quiet compassion, connection deepens with others, with yourself, with the present. As the vow is practiced over time, it becomes less of an effort and more of a homecoming. Silence stops being a challenge and starts becoming a refuge. You begin to crave it, not to escape, but to reset. You start to protect it, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Because you've seen what happens when speech is delayed, when emotions are held, when presence is chosen. Peace rises, clarity returns, healing becomes natural, and you begin to realize words can only do so much. There are places inside you that only silence can reach. This is the vow of Mona. Not to escape life, but to see it clearly. Not to reject the world, but to return to it with a heart that has been purified by stillness. And when silence is no longer just something practiced, but something lived, when it's not just a break from noise, but the very space where truth is met, another level of healing begins, deeper than habit, deeper than rest. It is the end of conflict, not outside, but within. Because underneath every story, every opinion, every reaction, there is a quiet war. Thought versus thought. Doubt versus belief. Self-image versus reality. And this war doesn't need louder answers. It needs stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't take sides. The Buddha's silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate. When faced with questions meant to trap or provoke, he didn't always reply. Not because he lacked answers, but because he saw the trap, the mind's addiction to needing to win, the ego's hunger to defend itself, the illusion that talking more brings peace. He didn't try to fix every confusion with words. He offered space instead, the kind of space where the need to argue dissolves before it begins. That same space lives within everyone, but most never touch it, because the moment discomfort arises, the reflex is to think louder, argue harder, defend quicker. Mental debates run endlessly. Should I have said that? Why did they act that way? What if this happens? The mind becomes a courtroom, and the ego, it wants to win every case. But silence has no side. It's not a defense. It's a release. Letting silence end the war inside the mind begins with a single shift, choosing not to argue with yourself. Not because you've surrendered to defeat, but because you no longer believe that every thought needs a response. Most internal battles are recycled energy, old fears wearing new masks, childhood echoes wrapped in adult language. And the only reason they keep circling is because attention keeps feeding them. When silence is chosen, not out of exhaustion, but out of wisdom, the cycle stops. The loop ends. The story loses its script. And a strange thing happens. The thoughts keep moving, but they no longer land. The emotions rise, but they don't drown you. They pass like wind through open space. Nothing to cling to, nothing to push. This kind of silence is not just the absence of sound, it's the absence of conflict. Not because there's nothing happening inside, but because you've stopped taking sides. In meditation, this practice becomes clear. Thoughts come up, opinions, old memories, regrets, the urge to replay a conversation, to defend a past decision, to justify a choice. But instead of reacting, you sit, you breathe, you don't follow, you don't resist, you witness. And that witnessing creates a shift, not in the content, but in your relationship to the content. The mind will say, "But you need to explain yourself." Silence says, "Let it be." The ego says, "You were wronged, you need justice." Silence says, "Watch the pain, not the story." The fear says, "You need to prepare for every outcome." Silence replies, "Stay here, let this moment be enough." And with time, the mind begins to learn. Not through logic, through repetition, through the repeated experience of peace when nothing is said, nothing is answered, and nothing is controlled. That's when the war inside begins to dissolve, because it's no longer necessary. The self that needed to be right, to be liked, to be perfect, that self isn't being fed anymore. And without attention, it fades. This doesn't mean apathy. It doesn't mean detachment from life. It means involvement without inner resistance. You live fully, but you're not arguing with life while doing it. You let others speak without rehearsing your reply. You feel anger rise, and you let it rise without wrapping it in justification. You stop narrating your pain and instead allow it to pass. Buddhist silence does not erase thoughts. It renders them powerless. It allows space between the trigger and the reaction. And in that space, clarity grows. You begin to see, this thought isn't new. This fear has been here before. This conflict isn't about what it seems. And more than anything, you begin to see that the peace you thought had to be earned was here the entire time. It was just buried beneath defense. Defense against judgment, against rejection, against being misunderstood. But the irony is, the more we defend, the more fragmented we feel. The louder we get, the less we hear. The more we push, the less we rest. Silence ends the war not by overpowering it, but by withdrawing its energy. Think of how often the inner voice fights against what already is. It shouldn't have happened. I shouldn't feel this way. They should understand me. These are the starting points of most mental noise, and yet every one of them is a resistance to reality, a rejection of the present. And in Buddhism, it's this resistance, not the event itself, that causes suffering. When silence enters, it doesn't agree or disagree. It holds the moment without needing to fix it. And from that holding, something remarkable unfolds. Understanding, forgiveness, release. Not because the situation changed, but because your grip on it did. This is why silence is not inaction. It's the most powerful non-reaction. It's what turns the mind from a battlefield into a sanctuary, from a courtroom into a temple, from a place of endless noise into a space of quiet wisdom. The ego will resist this, because the ego thrives on comparison. It wants to argue, it wants to be heard, it needs a villain. But in silence, there are no enemies, there are only patterns, seen clearly, watched gently, and allowed to dissolve. Even physical healing begins here. Studies in neurobiology show that when the mind quiets, the body follows. In deep silence, heart rate lowers, cortisol drops, inflammation reduces. Because the body is no longer responding to a constant stream of perceived threats, most of which were never real to begin with. Mental wars don't just happen during big events. They happen in the background constantly. The self-talk after a social interaction, the criticism after a mistake, the endless list of what-ifs, and all of them drain energy, not because they're happening, but because they're believed. Buddhist silence doesn't ask you to deny your mind. It invites you to stop worshipping it. To watch without becoming, to listen without agreeing, to feel without collapsing. And that changes the game. Eventually, peace is no longer something you chase. It becomes the default, not because the world becomes easier, but because your mind stops turning every moment into a debate. The inner judge steps down. The inner critic grows quiet. The need to constantly defend who you are fades. And what remains is a person who doesn't need to be right because they're already whole. This is not passive spirituality. This is the heart of freedom, the kind that lives beneath thought, the kind that remains when explanation ends, the kind that whispers, "You don't have to fight anymore." And that whisper, that truth, it can only be heard in silence. Let that silence grow. Let it fill the spaces where tension used to live. Let it reach the corners of your mind that used to echo with arguments. Let it bring peace where only noise used to be. Because now, the war is over. And what comes next is the building of a new home within. A silent room the world can't shake. A space so rooted in stillness that no noise can reach it. No chaos can undo it. And once the war inside quiets, once the mind stops trying to win every moment, something rare begins to unfold. Not silence as a temporary state, but silence as a place. Not an absence, but a presence. A sacred space within you where the world cannot enter, no matter how loud it becomes. This is the silent room within. And it doesn't exist outside of life. It exists inside it. Always here, always available. Built not with walls, but with awareness. For centuries, monks have spoken of this inner sanctuary, not in metaphors, but in lived experience. A space they enter in meditation, in ritual, in breath, and sometimes even in daily life. A space where thoughts may arise, but they don't disturb. Where sensations may pass, but they don't stick. Where the identity that reacts to the world loses its grip, and what remains is just stillness, pure, undisturbed. Not an escape from life, but the center of it. This inner room is not a fantasy. It's a practice, and it begins with attention. The kind of attention that doesn't move with every distraction, that doesn't chase thoughts or resist emotion, the kind of attention that stays, that rests, that turns inward without collapsing. When cultivated, this attention becomes the doorway to the inner temple, the space where silence is not just a tool, but a home. In Buddhist monasteries, external silence supports this process, but the real work happens within. Monks learn to sit with discomfort without needing to solve it, to feel emotion without narration, to stay still even when the body or mind resists. This consistent turning inward builds something durable, a kind of invisible architecture that can't be shaken by circumstances. It's not about detaching from the world, it's about being rooted in something deeper while moving through it. The silent room within is not sterile, it's not numb, it's alive, soft, spacious. It allows joy without clinging. It allows grief without drowning. It's where peace lives before explanation. And the more time you spend there, the less you need from the outside. Not because you reject life, but because you've finally touched a source that doesn't change when life does. To build this space, start with breath, not controlling it, just noticing it. Let each breath anchor you deeper into presence. Let your attention rest where the inhale begins, where the exhale ends. Don't chase. Don't adjust. Just stay. When thoughts arise, let them pass like people walking outside your window. You see them, but you don't follow. Over time, this kind of awareness becomes your foundation. Next, notice sensation, the contact between your body and the seat, the rhythm of your chest, the coolness of the air. Let sensation ground you, not in thought, but in direct experience. This sensory awareness draws you out of the mental storm and into the now, into the stillness that never left. As you do this, resist the urge to label. That's the mind trying to decorate the silence, trying to turn the room into a museum of ideas. But this space is not conceptual, it's felt, known directly, and it does not need to be improved. The less you interfere, the more it reveals. Over time, the room takes shape, not in form, but in function. It becomes the place you return to when emotions rise, when stress builds, when noise tempts you to react. You go inward, not to hide, but to reset, not to escape, but to remember that who you are is not defined by reaction, that your peace doesn't need permission from the world. This inner space becomes a refuge, a place where no insult reaches, where no praise disturbs, where no fear takes root. Because in this room, you've let go of identity, of narrative, of needing to be seen. You're not performing, you're not proving, you're simply present. And that presence becomes your protection. In Buddhism, this space is sometimes referred to as the unconditioned, the part of the mind not shaped by past experience or future worry. It's not touched by memory, it doesn't plan, it just is. And though it sounds abstract, it can be touched through direct practice, through consistent silence, through staying with what is, without adding story. There's a sacred paradox here. The more time you spend in this inner stillness, the more skillfully you move through the outer world. Not because you've detached, but because you've anchored. When someone criticizes you, you feel it, but you don't collapse. When stress appears, it rises, but it doesn't own you. Because part of you is always in the room, always untouched. And that's the point. Not to stop life from happening, but to stop life from shaking you. The silent room within is not about avoiding experience. It's about welcoming all of it without becoming all of it. From this space, you can grieve without fear. You can love without grasping. You can act without ego, because you're no longer trying to get somewhere. You're already home. Monks spend decades refining this practice, but it doesn't require robes or retreats. It requires commitment, a daily return to silence, a refusal to get pulled into every internal dialogue, a willingness to be with yourself without distraction, not as punishment, but as devotion. And slowly, things begin to change. You start to feel calm in places that used to trigger you. You start to smile at thoughts you used to believe. You start to rest in moments that used to create urgency. Not because the world softened, but because you did. Because you built a room where clarity lives. This room does not isolate. It connects. The more stable your inner silence, the more open you become to others. You stop needing people to fix your feelings. You stop needing every conversation to validate you. You become a better listener, a clearer speaker, because you speak from depth, not from habit. There's a saying in Zen, when the mind is still, the whole universe surrenders. This doesn't mean you dominate life. It means you stop resisting it. And when resistance drops, peace rises, not from effort, but from alignment. The silent room within is not a fantasy. It's a responsibility, a place only you can build, only you can protect, and only you can return to. But once it's built, it will hold you in every season, in joy and sorrow, in clarity and confusion. It doesn't need you to be perfect. It only needs you to be present. And this presence, it becomes your teacher, your healer, your anchor in a world that keeps shifting. You start to live from this space, speak from this space, decide from this space. And in doing so, you bring silence into everything, not as absence, but as power, as love, as the deepest expression of who you truly are. And now, from this inner temple, we move towards something even deeper, a place where ego itself begins to loosen, where silence does more than soothe, it transforms, where the old self begins to dissolve, not with struggle, but with surrender. Because in the presence of true stillness, the ego cannot survive. And once that inner sanctuary becomes familiar, once stillness is no longer a visitor, but a resident, a deeper change begins to unfold. Not just moments of peace, but the beginning of something irreversible. The soft collapse of who you thought you were. The melting of every role, every mask, every identity built on needing to be someone in the eyes of others. Silence doesn't just quiet the mind, it simulates death, not of the body, but of the ego. And in its place, something new begins to take shape, not a better version of the old self, but a rebirth into presence, simplicity, and peace that no longer performs. In Buddhism, silence is not only rest, it is transformation. It dismantles the false self, piece by piece, not through effort, but through absence. When speech stops, when reaction stops, when performance stops, what remains is a raw, unguarded awareness. And that awareness is the beginning of rebirth. This process isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself, it begins quietly, in moments where you no longer need to explain yourself, in pauses where you feel no desire to be seen, in breaths where the old voice in your head tries to speak, but fades instead. These small disappearances are the slow death of the ego, the mental construct that constantly needs to manage, defend, justify, and control. The ego isn't a villain. It was built to help you survive, to keep you safe, to give you a name and a place in the world. But what helped you survive can't help you awaken. The ego is built from noise, stories, comparisons, expectations, praise, criticism. It thrives on labels, but silence removes the label maker. And when that falls away, what's left is presence without personality, awareness without an image to protect. This is where the old self begins to die, not through destruction, but through irrelevance. You stop needing to keep up appearances. You stop needing to be right. You stop needing to prove you're good enough. Silence becomes a kind of internal funeral, where everything unnecessary is laid to rest. The death of ego is not dramatic. It is not aggressive. It is the result of deep watching. You begin to see how often you speak just to keep your self-image alive. How often you argue not to serve truth, but to protect identity. How often your thoughts are shaped by the fear of disappearing. And in silence, you do disappear, at least the version of you that needed noise to feel real. And what's reborn is not a concept. It's not a new identity. It's something quieter, softer, a self that doesn't need a story, a self that doesn't exist in contrast to others, a self that does not arrive with credentials or history, but with presence alone. This quiet rebirth doesn't come all at once. It comes in layers. First, the outer expressions fall away. Less need to speak, less need to react, less need to share opinions. Then, the inner dialogues begin to soften. Less mental rehearsal, less internal criticism, less judgment. Finally, the deepest shift occurs, where even the observer becomes transparent, where you're not just watching thoughts, but watching the one who watches. And eventually, even that boundary fades. In Buddhist practice, this is sometimes described as the deathless state, not because the body lives forever, but because the self you thought could die is no longer central. The fear of death begins to fade, not because you deny it, but because you've already experienced the disappearance of self. Silence becomes a rehearsal for letting go, and each time you sit in it, another layer of ego peels away. There is a strange peace in this death, a freedom that can't be explained, because what dies is not the ability to live, but the need to perform while living. You stop being a character in your own life. You start being life itself. You start moving without needing to be noticed. You start loving without needing it to be returned. You start breathing without needing to announce that you're breathing. And in this quiet rebirth, everything becomes lighter. You stop carrying the weight of your history. You stop carrying the pressure of your future. The body relaxes. The nervous system resets. The heart opens, not as a dramatic awakening, but as a steady softening, a slow return to the center that was never lost, just hidden under layers of noise. This transformation doesn't mean you stop functioning. You still engage with the world. You still work, connect, speak when needed. But something inside has changed. There is no longer a grasping for identity, no more hunger to be affirmed. Your actions are no longer echoes of insecurity. They become reflections of clarity. The people around you may notice. They may say you've become quieter, calmer, harder to provoke. What they're really seeing is the absence of ego, the space where tension used to live, the silence that now speaks louder than the words it replaced. The process can be disorienting. There may be moments when the mind panics, tries to reclaim its role. It may flood you with doubt. Who are you without ambition, without opinion, without struggle? But these are echoes, the dying gasps of a self that thrived on complexity. Let them pass. Stay silent. Keep watching. In the Zen tradition, this phase is often marked by the phrase, no self. But it doesn't mean emptiness in a negative sense. It means fullness without edges, being without needing to be anything specific. It's not losing yourself. It's being so free you no longer need to define what yourself even means. This is why silence is revered, not because it makes you quieter, but because it reveals what was always true beneath the noise. It doesn't give you peace. It removes what blocked it. It doesn't hand you a new identity. It frees you from needing one. This rebirth is not something you achieve. It's something you allow by not interrupting the silence, by not escaping the stillness when it becomes uncomfortable, by sitting through the fading of the old until the new no longer needs to arrive. It simply is. There is a kind of joy that arises here, not the high of excitement, but the deep ease of being unburdened, the joy of waking up without needing to carry your image, the joy of being enough without needing to earn it, the joy of stillness that cannot be disturbed by success or failure. And with this joy comes a different kind of compassion, one that doesn't pity, one that doesn't perform, a compassion that arises from shared humanity, from knowing that everyone is carrying some version of the same noisy burden, and knowing that silence, not advice, is often the real medicine. You begin to live differently. You speak only when it serves truth. You rest often without guilt. You listen more than you talk. You value quiet moments as deeply as achievements. You become aware of when the ego tries to return, and you smile at it instead of obeying. This is not about becoming passive. It's about becoming peaceful. So peaceful that nothing needs to be forced. So clear that decisions arise naturally. So grounded that the world no longer pulls you in every direction. That's what this quiet death offers. Not an end, but a beginning free from noise, free from drama, free from the constant performance of being someone. And once the false layers have quietly fallen away, once there is no need to prove, perform, or protect, what remains is not emptiness, but presence. And within that presence, something powerful begins to flow without effort, not through speech, not through gestures, but through stillness itself. The kind of stillness that can hold another person without a single word. The kind of gaze that doesn't judge, doesn't demand, but simply stays. This is the language of still eyes, a silent compassion that speaks where sound cannot reach. In Buddhism, compassion isn't only shown through action or advice. It is most deeply expressed through how one is. A presence that carries no tension, no pressure, no agenda. A presence that allows others to feel seen without being examined, to feel safe without being managed. And this begins not with technique, but with stillness, the stillness that comes after ego falls quiet. When a monk sits in meditation, they are not only cultivating inner peace, they are cultivating a presence that can be felt by others, a presence that calms the space around them. It's not dramatic, it's not designed. But when someone enters the room, they feel it. The silence becomes a kind of invitation, an unspoken message. You don't need to perform here, you can rest. This kind of compassion is not created, it is revealed. It flows naturally from the person who has stopped needing to center themselves, who has stepped back far enough to see that listening, without interruption or correction, is a rare form of love. That being fully present, without commentary, is often more healing than anything said aloud. Still, eyes don't stare, they don't scan, they don't search for a flaw or a reaction. They rest gently. They observe without evaluation. And that still gaze says more than advice ever could. It says, I see you, and I'm not trying to change you. That alone can soften another person's armor, not through persuasion, but through peace. In Buddhist culture, there are many moments of shared silence. Teacher and student, monk and layperson, friend and friend. The silence between them is not awkward, it is respected, because both know that truth often needs space to rise, that pain doesn't always need solving, that the heart can open when it is not being examined. Stillness is not passive in these moments. It is active, but without pressure. It watches with care. It listens beyond words. It makes room for someone to arrive as they are. That's why monks don't rush to comfort with words when someone cries. They sit beside them. They breathe with them. They stay. That staying, without speaking, can be more comforting than 1,000 apologies. To master this kind of silent compassion requires a shift in focus, away from what to say and toward how to be. It begins with noticing your own energy. Are you tense when others speak? Are you planning your reply while they're still talking? Are you holding back your presence because of discomfort? These are signs of inner noise. And when the noise is quieted, presence deepens. And when presence deepens, compassion becomes effortless. The reason still presence is so healing is because it carries no demand. Most people are used to being fixed, judged, or coached, even in subtle ways. But when someone sits with them and does none of that, their nervous system relaxes, their breathing slows, their defenses drop. Because they're not being observed as a problem, they're being witnessed as a person. And witnessing is a sacred act. In Buddhism, to witness means to see without interfering. It's the opposite of control. It's the art of holding space for another without trying to shape their experience. This requires strength. Not the strength to act, but the strength to refrain. To let someone be in pain without rushing to change it. To let them speak without jumping in. To trust that your stillness is enough. Still eyes are not disconnected. They are more connected than most realize. But they're not anxious. They're not looking for cues. They're not trying to fix. They are soft, open, present. They tell the other person, you are safe here. You are not being measured. And when that is felt, something shifts. The other person may cry, or smile, or go silent themselves, because in that moment they are no longer performing. They are no longer afraid. They feel held, not by words, but by attention, by energy that doesn't move too fast or press too hard. This is why in Buddhist rituals there are often long pauses, gaps of silence that are not fillers, but spaces of presence. These pauses allow everything to land. They let the meaning settle in the body. They give room for truth to breathe. and they train everyone involved to be comfortable with not knowing, not rushing, not filling. The practice of still presence can begin in small ways. Try holding someone's gaze without tension. Let your face soften. Let your breath stay steady. Don't look for a reaction. Just stay. You're not waiting. You're not guiding. You're simply being. And in that being, your compassion is felt more deeply than any advice could ever be. Or try listening fully, without nodding or affirming, without offering your story. Just let the person speak. Let their voice unfold. Let their words shape the space. And when they finish, don't rush to respond. Let the silence linger. That silence is not emptiness. It is presence. It is acknowledgement. It is love that trusts itself. Over time, this practice builds trust, not only with others, but with yourself. You begin to see that you don't need to be useful to be valuable, that your presence, when rooted in peace, is already enough, that the deepest care does not always come through action, but through spacious attention. This kind of compassion also protects you. It keeps you from overreaching, from overgiving, from trying to rescue people who don't need rescuing. It teaches you to be fully available without becoming entangled, to offer support without losing your own ground, to give without draining, because your compassion flows from stillness, not from urgency. Still eyes are not blank. They are aware. They are awake, but they are not reactive. They have seen the impermanence of every emotion, every thought, every mood. And because of this, they do not flinch. They do not rush. They rest. And in their resting, they calm others too. This is why monks are often seen as calming even when they say nothing. It's not magic. It's not mystery. It's mastery of presence. Years of watching the mind. Years of letting go, years of refining their own energy until it becomes a quiet refuge for others. And you don't need to be a monk to learn this. You only need to begin. Begin by choosing not to interrupt. Begin by softening your gaze. Begin by breathing before speaking. Begin by trusting that the silence between two people can carry more healing than the most beautiful words. And as this becomes your way, you'll begin to see changes. People will feel safer around you. They will open more. They will feel calmer, even if they don't know why. And you will carry yourself differently, not with pride, but with peace. The kind of peace that does not seek the spotlight, because it knows that presence is enough. This is the power of silent compassion, a language beyond words, a transmission of peace through stillness alone. And from here, we go further. Because the next teacher isn't a human at all, but nature itself, the original master of wordless wisdom, a mountain that says nothing but teaches stillness, a river that doesn't explain but reveals flow, a tree that offers shade without asking for thanks. And after learning how still eyes can soften hearts without sound, how presence alone can carry the weight of compassion, something becomes clear. Words were never the real teachers. The deepest lessons were never shouted. They weren't printed or spoken. They were felt, known, absorbed through stillness. And no teacher delivers that kind of knowing more purely than nature. Trees, rivers, mountains, skies, they say nothing, yet teach everything. They don't need to convince. They don't try to persuade. They simply exist so fully, so silently, that their presence becomes a transmission. And those who are quiet enough to listen receive wisdom that no book could hold. In Buddhism, nature has always been more than scenery. It is the original temple, the oldest teacher. Long before monasteries were built, practitioners sat beneath trees. They didn't decorate the silence, they entered it. The Buddha himself reached enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, not in a lecture hall. And he did it not by mastering doctrine, but by observing life without interruption. Nature offered the perfect conditions, nothing to distract, nothing to debate, nothing to achieve, just being, just breath, just what is. Trees don't hurry, but they grow. They don't speak, but they communicate. And they never resist what is. Rain falls, and they receive it. Wind comes, and they sway. They lose their leaves when the season demands it. They break and heal without complaint. Their silence is not emptiness, it's acceptance, and in their quiet rhythm, they remind us what it means to live in harmony with change, to not cling to one form, to not fight cycles, to not fear what comes and goes. Buddhist monks often retreat to forests, not just for solitude, but for alignment. Because nature doesn't perform. It doesn't ask for anything. Its silence is honest. And when you sit long enough among the trees, your breath syncs with theirs, your thoughts slow. The inner noise quiets, not because you forced it, but because nature gave you a mirror that reflects stillness, not judgment. That reminds you, growth does not require a story. Presence does not need effort. Rivers teach a different lesson. They never hold on. They move with whatever appears. They adapt to shape and stone. They do not resist the path. They become it. And in doing so, they show us the meaning of flow, not passive surrender, but intelligent movement. Every rock they pass was once seen as an obstacle, but the river does not stop to argue. It finds another way, always forward, always soft, but always unstoppable. The river teaches the heart how to keep going without hardening, how to move through difficulty without becoming it. In Buddhist philosophy, this quality is known as non-resistance, the ability to let things be as they are without adding more pain through mental tension. Nature models this perfectly. Nothing in the natural world overthinks. Nothing clings to what has passed. Nothing resists what comes. And yet everything transforms, grows, adjusts. All without words, all without plans. This is the wisdom of the natural world, not taught in sentences, but demonstrated in form. Mountains offer another kind of lesson. Stillness not as pause, but as presence that cannot be moved. They do not chase, they do not explain, they simply stand. And in that standing, they embody strength without force. They hold space for storms, for silence, for centuries of change. And yet they remain, not proud, not defensive, just steady. And those who sit near them begin to feel that steadiness in their own bones. When a person meditates at the foot of a mountain, they are not just sitting still, they are being held by something ancient, something unmoved by time. And that influence enters the nervous system. It teaches the practitioner that not every feeling must be followed, that not every thought deserves a reaction, that there is a deeper ground beneath every storm, a silence that doesn't flinch, a stillness that doesn't flee. Even small details in nature hold wisdom. The way a leaf falls without hesitation, the way a flower opens without forcing, the way dawn arrives each day without announcement. There is no ego in these moments, no one asking to be seen, no one trying to impress. And yet, the presence is so full it fills the heart. It softens the mind, it heals without touching. This is why monks often speak of the Dharma not as something created, but as something discovered. The laws of life are already present, in the changing of seasons, in the birth and death of all things, in the quiet patience of a seed becoming a tree. Nature is always teaching. The question is, are we still enough to receive it? Even the sky teaches. It allows clouds to come and go without preference. It holds both storm and sunshine without clinging. It never asks the weather to behave. It simply remains open. And that openness is not passive, it is infinite. The sky does not push away what is unpleasant. It does not grab what is beautiful. It just makes space. In Buddhist practice, this is the heart of mindfulness. Observing without ownership. Feeling without fusion. Not resisting what arises. Not chasing what leaves. Nature does not preach. It does not correct. It doesn't argue for your attention. And yet, when you stand beneath a tree or sit beside a river, something inside begins to quiet, because the body remembers what the mind forgot, that peace was never complicated. It was simply lost under layers of noise. And the more you stay in nature's presence, the more those layers fall, one breath at a time. This is not poetic exaggeration, it's direct experience. Every tradition rooted in deep presence has turned to nature, not for decoration, but for transformation. Indigenous wisdom, Taoist reflection, Zen simplicity, they all point to the same truth, that nature is not just background, it's guidance, not just environment, it's teacher. And what it teaches is not theory, it teaches how to live. It teaches you that not everything needs a solution, that rest is productive, that silence is full, that growth takes time, that beauty does not depend on being seen, that letting go is part of renewal, that wholeness does not require perfection. These lessons are not explained in words. They are absorbed through presence, felt in the body, realized in the heart. Nature also shows us our place, not above, not separate, but woven into the same cycle. We breathe the breath the trees provide. We eat what grows from soil. We return to the ground when our bodies are done. And when this is understood, not intellectually but viscerally, humility arises. Not from shame, but from connection. A reverence for life that speaks without preaching. This is what Buddhist silence seeks to return us to. Not a forced stillness, but a natural one. Not an escape from life, but a return to its rhythm. And in nature, that rhythm is never broken. It is only ignored. But when we slow down, when we listen, not with ears but with presence, we find ourselves being taught again, taught by wind, by waves, by the space between birdsong, and slowly we begin to match that rhythm. We stop rushing, we stop chasing, we stop needing. And in that space, something opens. A peace not made but revealed. A clarity not spoken but felt. A truth not taught but lived. Nature teaches enlightenment not by giving answers, but by dissolving the questions. It doesn't point to some future state. It pulls you into now, where the tree is enough, where the breath is enough, where you, without explanation, are already whole. And once the rhythm of nature starts to live inside the breath, once the body slows and the mind stops asking for explanations, a strange thing begins to happen. Not just peace, not just quiet, but a soft fading of identity itself. Not because something was taken, but because something is no longer needed. The voice inside that says, me, mine, I want, I need, becomes quieter. The center point of experience starts to dissolve, and what remains is life, unfolding, awareness, watching, without a narrator, without a title, without a character to protect. This is the disappearance of the I in prolonged silence, and it changes everything. In many Buddhist traditions, silence is not just a practice, it's a doorway. It leads not only to clarity or calm, but to the collapse of the illusion that there is a fixed self sitting inside the body, directing everything. This illusion is so normal, it's never questioned. A person says, I am thinking, I am afraid, I am hurt. But in prolonged silence, that speaker begins to fade. Thoughts still come, feelings still move. But the sense that there's a solid identity behind them begins to fall apart. Silent retreats reveal this in a way no book or talk can. When speech is removed for days, when interaction is stopped, when you no longer say your name or look in the mirror or perform your personality, something cracks. The ego starts to lose its anchors. It can't feed on feedback. It can't maintain its shape through routine conversation. And without that fuel, it weakens. What's left is not confusion, but freedom. Because most of what is called I is not actually chosen. It's remembered, rehearsed, reinforced through repetition. It's a looping narrative formed from past experience, future fear, social mirrors. But in silence, there is no one reflecting you back to yourself, no one to remind you of your roles, no one to agree or disagree with your identity. And that absence forces a deep confrontation. What am I if I stop telling the story? This is not a philosophical idea. It is a direct, bodily, destabilizing shift. During silent retreats, there often comes a moment, sometimes after hours, sometimes after days, where the inner voice that usually speaks in first person seems to fall away. It doesn't mean there are no thoughts, but the thoughts no longer claim ownership. This is painful replaces I am suffering. There is fear replaces I am afraid. It's subtle, but it opens a different reality. The more silence continues, the more transparent the mind becomes. And in that transparency, there's nothing left to cling to. The old self, with all its preferences, achievements, wounds and hopes, begins to feel like a costume that was never truly necessary. You see how often you lived from habit, how often I was used to justify reaction, how deeply identity was used to separate. And then, suddenly, it's not needed anymore. Not because you lose memory, but because memory no longer defines who is sitting there. Experience continues, breathing continues, emotions come and go, but the one who watches does not cling. And that watcher, it has no name, no age, no history. It simply observes. This is what Buddhist silence points toward, not just inner quiet, but the dissolution of the false center, the breaking down of the belief that there is a permanent me in charge. And with that breaking comes the greatest relief, because when the self disappears, so does the need to protect it, to defend it, to improve it, and the weight you didn't even realize you were carrying suddenly lifts. This is not a loss, it's a return to natural awareness, a return to the space that was always here before the identity was formed. In some traditions, this is called no self. In others, pure presence. In Zen, it's simply sitting, no agenda, no identity, just being. The ego cannot survive without noise. It needs reaction. It needs narrative. It needs problems to solve and positions to defend. But silence offers none of that. It offers only what is. The sound of birds, the rise of breath, the ache in the knees, the flicker of light, all seen clearly, all without commentary. In long silence, you begin to feel less like a separate observer of experience and more like experience itself. The boundaries blur. I am meditating becomes meditation is happening. I am here becomes just here. And the more this deepens, the more peaceful the mind becomes, because the root of restlessness is identification, the tension of holding up a self that never stops moving. And when that self dissolves, time dissolves with it. The day no longer feels long or short. The future loses its urgency. The past loses its grip. What's left is now, and now is enough. Not in theory, but in truth. A truth that needs no explanation, no name, no reference point. This is why people emerge from silent retreats looking different. Softer eyes, slower movements, a kind of gentle emptiness. Not because they've become less, but because they've stopped pretending to be more than they are. They've tasted life without a story, and that taste changes what hunger feels like. Even outside of retreat, these effects remain. You begin to see how often you use I when it's not needed. I think, I want, I believe. And sometimes silence answers back. So what? And the thought drops. Not in dismissal, but in understanding that the speaker was never required for the thought to exist. Experience was already happening. It didn't need ownership. This shift doesn't make you blank or empty in the negative sense. It makes you light, available, responsive rather than reactive. You stop living as a character. You start living as consciousness, not separate from the world, but woven into it. And from this place, compassion deepens, because there is less me and you, just awareness recognizing itself in different forms. The ego may return, it often does. But once you've seen through it, it can't fully trick you anymore. You begin to laugh at the old patterns. You let them rise and fall like waves without needing to surf them. You let silence wash through the mind without trying to hold it. And each time, the self softens a little more. In prolonged silence, identity thins, and what was once the center becomes transparent, not erased, not destroyed, just seen for what it was, a useful fiction. And once it's seen, something real can take its place. Not a new self, not a better image, but presence. Awareness without shape, consciousness without boundary. This is the heart of Buddhist awakening, Not becoming someone enlightened, but realizing there was never a someone to begin with. Only the play of thought, only the dance of form, and beneath it all, the silent witness, no face, no voice, just clarity. And now, from the place where the I fades, we explore a mirror. A still surface held by silence itself. Not to erase what's within, but to reveal it. Because when nothing is spoken, everything rises. Emotions buried, fears unprocessed, desires unmet. And in that mirror, something sacred begins to happen. And once the sense of I begins to dissolve, once the old voice no longer claims every experience, what's left is not silence alone. It's a mirror. A space so still, it reflects everything hidden beneath the noise. Not to accuse, not to shame, but to reveal. Silence, when held with awareness, becomes the most honest surface. It shows what speech hides. It shows what performance covers. And in that reflection, something long buried finally begins to rise. The fear that wasn't named, the grief that wasn't felt, the desire that was denied. All of it appears, not because silence created it, but because silence stopped covering it up. This is one of the most sacred and confronting uses of silence in Buddhist practice, to turn it inward, to sit not for calm, but for truth, not to escape emotion, but to uncover it. When all distractions are paused, when nothing is being said or reacted to, awareness has no choice but to face itself. And in that facing, the deeper work begins. Many emotions remain unseen, not because they are gone, but because they have been spoken over, turned into thoughts, translated into stories. But the original feeling stays buried, unfinished, and as long as it's unseen, it continues to influence behavior from underneath. It shows up in habits, reactions, and discomforts that don't make sense on the surface. Silence becomes the place where these unfinished emotions can rise, breathe, and finally be released. This requires more than stillness. It requires willingness. To sit with discomfort without narrating it. To feel what surfaces without labeling it. The mind will try to help. It will say, "This is sadness from that time," or "This is fear about that person." But silence invites a different approach. It asks you not to explain the emotion, but to feel it fully without needing to attach it to anything. In the stillness of extended silence, the body begins to speak in its own way. A tightening in the chest, a lump in the throat, a flutter in the stomach. These are not problems, they are signals. They are parts of you that were silenced long before you chose silence. Now, they're returning, not to overwhelm, but to be heard for the first time without interruption. Buddhist monks describe this process not as analysis, but as opening. The emotional body unwinds when it feels safe, and it feels safe when it is no longer being rushed, fixed, or ignored. Silent presence becomes the holding space, a space where no reaction is needed, where nothing has to be said to be real, where an old ache can rise and simply exist without being suppressed again. There is no technique to force this, but there is a posture of mind that allows it, a kind of soft attention. You don't chase the emotion, you don't dissect it, you just notice it, as if it were a visitor arriving after years of silence. You let it speak in sensation. You stay close without gripping. And in that closeness, something shifts. The emotion moves. It doesn't disappear instantly, but it stops being trapped. Over time, silence reveals patterns. The recurring fear behind anger, the hidden shame beneath avoidance, the tenderness behind irritation. None of these were visible when the mind was too busy talking, when life was too loud. But in silence, the layers peel back, not because you force them, but because nothing is left to hold them down. This is not always comfortable. At first, silence may feel like it makes things worse. Old memories come back. Unfinished stories play again. But this is not regression. It is return. The mind is not broken. It is releasing. The heart is not weak. It is thawing. The discomfort is not a sign to stop. It is a sign that silence is working. The process is deeply personal. What arises will be different for everyone. But what matters is not what comes up. It's how it's met. If you meet it with resistance, it hides again. If you meet it with analysis, it gets filtered. But if you meet it with stillness, with breath, with patience, with space, it begins to unravel. Like a knot that loosens not with pulling, but with gentle attention. This practice becomes more powerful over time. The body begins to trust that silence is safe. The nervous system learns that stillness does not mean suppression. It means permission. And emotions that were once stuck start to move naturally. You may find tears rising for no clear reason, or laughter, or a sense of grief you thought was long gone. Let it come, let it leave. It's not re-traumatizing, it's releasing. Silence, as a mirror, doesn't just reflect pain, it also reflects longing, desires that were pushed away, dreams never voiced, needs that were buried under duty or fear. These may rise with a kind of aching beauty. And again, the work is not to judge them, but to feel them without conditions, not to decide what to do about them, but to let them be part of your full humanity. Monastic life trains this skill deeply. Hours spent in silence are not only for peace, they are for purification, not in a moral sense, but in an emotional one. Letting the river of silence wash over the heart until what's left is not perfect, but true, not controlled, but whole. You don't need a retreat to begin this. You only need time. A space where you can sit without distractions, a commitment to stay even when discomfort arises, and a willingness to trust that what comes up is not a threat, but a message. Something inside you trying to complete its cycle, something trying to return to balance. In the early stages, it helps to anchor attention in the body. The mind will try to leave, especially when emotion gets heavy. But if you keep your focus on breath, on posture, on sensation, the emotion stays grounded. It doesn't become overwhelming. It becomes energy, movement, awareness, and in that form, it can pass. Some traditions suggest placing a hand over the heart, not as a technique, but as a gesture of care, reminding yourself that whatever rises is allowed, that no part of you will be rejected, that silence is not judgment, it is sanctuary. As this becomes part of your practice, you may find less need to express emotions outwardly, not because you're suppressing, but because you're processing them at the source. You may talk less, but feel more. You may need less reassurance, because you've learned to reassure yourself through presence. You may cry more, but suffer less, because the tears are no longer blocked. Silence, as a mirror, also reveals beauty. the quiet joy that was always underneath, the lightness that follows release, the small moments that were once missed in the rush, and the growing trust that even the hardest emotions can be met without fear. What begins as reflection becomes transformation, not through strategy, but through surrender. You stop needing to be someone who handles things well. You become someone who lets things move through, and that letting becomes your healing. Eventually, this mirror becomes something you carry. In conversations, in crowded rooms, you no longer need to speak over discomfort. You no longer need to fill silence. You become the calm presence others feel safe around, not because you have answers, but because your silence is honest. And that honesty is rare. It is what people are starving for, even if they don't know it. A space where nothing needs to be performed, where every emotion is welcome, where stillness doesn't mean absence, but deep, radical presence. This is what silence offers, not just peace, but truth, not just quiet, but clarity, not just reflection, but release. And after silence begins to reveal what's hidden, after emotions rise, speak, and are finally released, what's left in that cleared space is not just freedom, but temptation. The mind, freshly emptied, looks for something to reach for, a thought to follow, a voice to hear, an opinion to share. It craves noise, not just sound, but stimulation, not because it needs it, but because it's used to it. And this craving, quiet but persistent, is the root of addiction most people never see, not to substances, but to attention, to speaking, to thinking. And now comes the deeper challenge, not to fill that space again, but to stay empty, on purpose. This is where silent abstinence begins. In Buddhism, restraint is not punishment. It is precision. It is the conscious decision to stop feeding what weakens clarity, to pause what the ego uses to survive. Most people associate addiction with obvious behavior, but in this practice, addiction includes subtle habits, the need to respond, to explain, to be noticed, to always be mentally active. These are internal compulsions, and, like all compulsions, they operate under the surface. They shape how you move, speak, react. Silence exposes them. And with that exposure comes the opportunity to break them, not through control, but through absence. Silent abstinence means choosing not to act on mental impulse, choosing not to speak when the urge rises, not because the moment demands silence, but because the mind has never known how to stop. The need to fill space with words, the pull to narrate experience, the habit of sharing every opinion, all of these are ways the ego keeps itself intact. Voluntary silence severs those lines, not violently, not dramatically, just by refusing to participate. This practice begins when you notice the craving to speak, and you don't. You feel the desire to respond, and you wait. You sense the thought forming, and you let it pass without giving it a voice. It feels small, but it isn't. Every time you pause, you cut a thread tied to identity, control, performance. And with each thread that breaks, the space inside you grows stronger. Not empty, just quiet, capable of holding itself without distraction. Monks train in this by taking temporary or long-term vows of silence, but the deeper training is not just about the voice, it's about energy, the energy that constantly reaches outward, that wants to be seen, heard, validated. In silence, that energy has nowhere to go, so it turns inward. At first, this creates discomfort, a feeling of restlessness. But that restlessness is not a problem. It's a signal. The nervous system is adjusting to stillness. The ego is losing one of its tools, and that loss, if held with patience, becomes freedom. What's revealed in this process is how often speech is used as escape. Escape from uncertainty, from boredom, from discomfort. People speak not always because they have something to say, but because they cannot bear to be with themselves. They think aloud to avoid stillness. They explain to avoid feeling, and this constant output keeps them tied to an inner dependency, the belief that meaning must always be performed. Silent abstinence offers a different path, one where meaning is not spoken, it's lived, where thoughts can arise and fade without comment, where discomfort can exist without being narrated, where presence no longer requires proof. And this path, while simple, is deeply radical. It refuses to participate in the cycle of constant reinforcement. It says, what if I don't respond? What if I let this moment be enough, exactly as it is? This changes everything. The body relaxes, the mind slows, the pressure to speak dissolves, and with that, something beautiful begins. A deep awareness of how much energy is spent trying to maintain an image. An image built on reactions, affirmations, roles. When those drop, you meet yourself not as a persona, but as presence. Silent abstinence also reveals the addiction to attention, not just receiving it, but managing it. The way the mind constantly checks how it's being perceived, the way it scans conversations for approval, the way it shapes words to protect image. These are not neutral acts, they are habits. Habits that keep the ego in control. In silence, they are seen clearly, and once they're seen, they can no longer run automatically. You may begin to notice how often you want to comment, how quickly the mind creates opinions, how intensely it wants to share, compare, correct. These are not random, they are patterns. And every time you choose silence instead, those patterns weaken, not because you resist them, but because you don't feed them. You sit still and they pass. You stay silent and they lose momentum. The silence becomes an anchor, a center point from which you observe without being pulled. And from this center, a different kind of clarity arises. You start to see which thoughts are real and which are just echoes. You notice how much of your energy was spent on things that didn't matter. You begin to choose not just your words, but your presence. This is not suppression, it's selection. It's knowing that every word shapes your inner landscape, that every sentence is an act of creation, and by abstaining from automatic speech, you create space for something purer to grow, something not driven by fear or habit or ego, but by clarity. With time, this becomes a kind of inner fasting, not to punish, but to cleanse. You fast from the need to be clever, to be right, to be known. You give those cravings space and then watch them fall away. Not because you fought them, but because you stopped needing them. And in the emptiness left behind, a deeper voice begins to speak. Not from the mind, but from awareness itself, shorter, slower, more true. You find that when you do speak again, The words are different. They carry less weight, less need, more care. Because they were not chosen by habit, they were chosen by silence. Silent abstinence also disrupts the cycle of compulsive thinking. Thoughts that loop, repeat, spiral. These are usually fed by language, by mental narration. When speech is paused, even internally, the thoughts lose scaffolding. They can't hold themselves up. They begin to unravel. And in their place, presence deepens. This kind of silence is not passive. It is fierce. It requires strength to withhold what habit wants to express. It requires humility to not be the voice in the room. It requires trust that your value is not in your opinions, but in your awareness. And this trust grows. With every moment you don't respond. With every urge you don't follow. You begin to see that you are not your cravings. You are the space beneath them, and that space is strong, quiet, whole. You can practice this anywhere. A meeting where you choose not to speak first. A conversation where you let a pause breathe. A moment of discomfort where you stay present instead of commenting. These small abstentions are powerful. They teach the mind that silence is not weakness, it is sovereignty. And from this sovereignty, a new kind of communication emerges. One that begins not with the need to be heard, but with the discipline to listen. One that speaks only when the silence has said everything it can. One that carries peace, not performance. Eventually, silent abstinence becomes natural, not as withdrawal, but as refinement. You speak less, but with more depth. You think less, but with more clarity. You react less, but respond more wisely. And the addiction to stimulation fades, not because life becomes dull, but because stillness becomes enough. You stop chasing noise because silence starts feeding you. And once the silence has trained you to see through craving, once it has loosened the grip of habit and removed the need to fill space with words, something strange begins to surface. Something that can't be explained, yet is deeply understood. A wisdom that arrives not through instruction, but through contradiction. A truth that deepens not when spoken, but when heard through stillness. This is the paradox at the heart of Zen. The more we say, the further we move from the truth. And yet, by saying nothing, the truth can speak through us. Silence here doesn't just restrain, it reveals. In the Zen tradition, this is more than poetic thinking. It is a path. One walked not through concepts, but through direct experience. And central to this path are the koans, paradoxical phrases, riddles, or questions given to students to break the logic of the thinking mind. They were never meant to be solved intellectually. They were meant to be lived, sat with, entered in stillness. Because the moment you try to answer them, you fall back into the mind. But if you hold them without grasping, something else happens. The mind breaks open. And in that break, clarity rises, not from thinking, but from awareness. Take, for example, one of the most well-known koans. What is the sound of one hand clapping? At first it seems absurd, nonsensical, but that's the point. The thinking mind cannot answer, and the more it tries, the more it fails. Until finally, the student surrenders, not in defeat, but in silence. And in that silence, the real answer is known, not in words, but in presence. This is why silence in Zen is not passive, it's radical. It confronts the ego's addiction to knowing. It interrupts the belief that truth can be possessed, and it introduces a different kind of knowing, one that exists before language, one that cannot be written, only lived. Many Zen masters refuse to answer questions directly. When asked, "What is enlightenment?" some would raise a finger, others would shout, some would remain perfectly still. None of these were random. Each action was a living koan, a gesture meant to bypass the intellect and shock the student into presence. The goal wasn't to give an answer. The goal was to destroy the question itself. Because in Zen, the real block to understanding isn't lack of information, it's too much reliance on thought. Words divide, define, explain. But some truths exist before division, before definition. And to reach them, the mind must be still, not just quiet, but emptied of assumptions. Only then can the paradox begin to work. Only then does silence become the loudest teacher. One Zen saying goes, "Don't seek the truth, just drop your opinions." And yet, how do you drop something without replacing it? The koan enters here, not with answers, but with friction. It introduces something the mind cannot control, a question that can't be closed, a phrase that won't submit, and in wrestling with it, the student exhausts the habit of mental control, until finally, in stillness, a shift happens, not in knowledge, but in perception. This is what Zen masters point to when they say things like, "The finger pointing at the moon is not the moon." Language can gesture, but the experience itself lives beyond it. And silence, refined through paradox, becomes the only thing that can touch it directly. In silent retreats, students often sit with a koan for hours or days, not to decode it, but to merge with it, to let it shape their awareness. The question becomes a mirror, a fire, a pressure that dissolves thought. And when the student finally stops trying to answer and simply becomes the question, awakening becomes possible, not as an idea, but as a shift in the way reality is seen. There's power in how absurd these teachings can sound. What was your face before your parents were born? When you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. These aren't invitations to analysis. They are traps for the analytical mind, traps designed with love. Because only when the mind admits it cannot know, can the heart start to feel what's been true all along. In everyday life, this same principle applies. Sometimes silence is the clearest message. When someone is grieving, it's not words that help, it's presence. When the world becomes too loud, it's not more noise that brings clarity, it's stillness. And when your own thoughts begin to spin, it's not thinking harder that solves it. It's sitting quietly, allowing the spin to slow on its own. Zen understands this deeply, that silence does not hide meaning. It reveals what noise covers up. The more one speaks, the more distortion enters. The more one quiets, the more space truth has to breathe. And this is why Zen monks often answer questions with a bow, or with a long pause, or with a smile that says nothing, but contains everything. The paradox is this: the truth cannot be said, but it can be known. Not by collecting thoughts, but by losing the need for them. Not by forming ideas, but by dissolving into presence. The answer in Zen is not given. It is found only when the one asking disappears. In this way, silence becomes not just a practice, but a kind of blade. It cuts through confusion, through attachment to form, through identification with the voice in the head. And each time it cuts, it reveals something simpler, lighter, truer, something that was never hidden, but simply unheard beneath all the mental noise. Some practitioners experience moments of sudden clarity while sitting with a koan. A sound becomes sharp, a breath feels infinite. The distinction between self and world softens. These moments are not caused by the koan, they are caused by the space the koan creates. A space where the thinking mind steps aside and direct experience steps forward. And what's felt in that space can't be taught through language. It can only be hinted at. And this is why the Zen path often feels strange to outsiders. It's not interested in answers, it's interested in awakening, not in explanation, but in experience. And silence, wielded with awareness, becomes the perfect tool for that awakening. Even outside of formal practice, this paradox remains. There are times when someone asks you a question, but the honest answer is presence. When no words can meet what the moment holds. And if you've trained in silence, you'll know not to rush. You'll trust the pause. You'll let the quiet do the speaking, because sometimes the most compassionate response is stillness. Sometimes the clearest answer is no answer at all. Zen koans are not problems to solve. They are doors. Doors that only open when you stop knocking. And silence is the key. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of full attention. The kind of attention that says, I am here, without grasping. I am aware, without needing. And that kind of presence is not silent because it has nothing to say. It's silent because it has already said everything. As you walk deeper into this kind of silence, life begins to feel different. Not softer, but clearer. The paradoxes no longer feel like riddles. They feel like reflections. You begin to see that life itself is a koan. That being alive without knowing why is the greatest mystery of all, and that living fully without needing an answer is the deepest form of peace. This is the teaching that no words can hold, a teaching that doesn't come from the mouth, but from the silence behind the eyes, a teaching that cannot be written, but can be lived. And once silence has taught through paradox, once presence itself has become the lesson, even the mind's resistance begins to take new forms. It shows up when the world grows dark and the house falls quiet, when sleep doesn't come and stillness feels endless. But what was once seen as a problem can now be transformed into practice. Restless nights, once filled with frustration, can become sacred ground, not through forcing rest, but through welcoming awareness. Because when the body cannot sleep, the mind can still awaken. This is how stillness turns insomnia into meditation, and how Buddhist monks have used those very hours to deepen their path. In Buddhist monastic life, the night is not wasted. When sleep is light or slow to come, monks do not fight it. They sit up in bed. They breathe. They enter the body with attention. They allow the hour to be what it is, another field of practice. No anger, no resistance, just a shift in posture, both physical and mental. This approach treats wakefulness not as a mistake, but as an invitation, because every moment, even those between midnight and dawn, carries the potential for awareness. This way of seeing the night changes everything. Instead of labeling sleeplessness as failure, it becomes a return to presence. There is no pressure to fall asleep. There is only the breath, the rise and fall of sensation, the quiet around you, the pulsing stillness within. You do not try to leave this moment. You let it hold you. And that letting becomes the practice. Many who struggle with insomnia suffer not from lack of sleep itself, but from the mind's reaction to it. The story begins. This is bad. I'll be tired tomorrow. Why can't I shut off? These thoughts become the real suffering, not the wakefulness. In Buddhist meditation, these stories are seen for what they are: mental constructions. They rise, they fall, they pass. And in silence, you learn not to follow them. You return to the breath, to the body, to the space between thoughts, and slowly you stop being a prisoner of the night. Stillness in the middle of the night has a different texture. There's less stimulation, fewer distractions. The world is asleep, and the mind, while active, is not pulled by outer noise. This creates a perfect opportunity to observe without reacting, to sit, not formally, but with care. No effort to achieve anything, just watching, feeling, being. This form of meditation is soft, open, and profoundly honest. You meet the mind without defense, and in that meeting, transformation happens. You don't need a cushion or incense, just awareness. Whether lying in bed or sitting upright, the point is not posture, it's presence. The silence of night supports it naturally. The dimness invites inward attention, and in this quiet, you begin to notice what's always been there: the subtle tension in your jaw, the temperature of your hands, the thoughts that repeat. Instead of reacting, you simply stay, and this staying rewires everything. Buddhist monks use these hours to meet themselves more fully, not because they prefer to be awake, but because they've learned that wakefulness is not the enemy. It's another doorway. And with enough practice, the mind learns to welcome it. This does not mean sleep is unimportant. It means sleep is no longer clung to. Peace is not postponed until the body drifts off. Peace becomes available now. There is a gentle rhythm to nighttime practice. No urgency, no outcome, just presence. Each breath becomes a reminder. This too is okay. This too can be met. And the more fully you accept this hour, the less resistance you feel. Ironically, that very surrender often leads to rest. But even if it doesn't, you've still won. Because you've trained in stillness. You've turned what used to be frustration into meditation. Over time, this approach changes your relationship with rest. You no longer see it as something to conquer. You see it as something to cooperate with. The mind softens its grip. The body begins to feel safe in stillness, even if it's awake. And the fear of insomnia loses its power, not because the night is different, but because your response is. The wisdom of Buddhist silence teaches that discomfort is not always to be removed. Sometimes it is to be witnessed. Sometimes it is to be sat with, breathed through, allowed to teach. Sleeplessness becomes one of those teachers. It brings you face to face with your patterns, with your expectations, with the parts of you that want to control what cannot be controlled, and it invites you to let go. Some monks say the deepest insights came not during daytime meditation, but during silent nights, when the world was quiet, when their resistance was gone, when the self they performed during the day had nothing left to hold on to. That's when they saw clearly. That's when the mind stopped pretending, and in that rawness they found freedom. This is available to everyone. You don't need robes or vows. You only need to stay with yourself, to meet the night not as a problem, but as a path. You can do this with simple breath awareness. Feel the inhale, feel the exhale. Count it if it helps, or focus on sensation, the weight of the blanket, the sound of the wind, the beating of the heart. Each of these is a gate, a way to step deeper into now. When thoughts come, notice them. Don't push them away, but don't chase them either. Let them rise and fall like waves. This letting is the essence of meditation. Not control, but non-clinging. You are not trying to fix the night. You are practicing freedom within it. There is beauty here, a kind of intimacy with yourself that cannot happen during the day. You meet the edges of your mind. You see what it grabs for. You learn what it fears. And you do it gently, without judgment, with a quiet hand. This is not just spiritual practice. This is self-compassion. And even when nothing seems to be happening, something is. Your nervous system is learning to settle without external reward. Your awareness is learning to stabilize without needing distraction. These are skills far more valuable than sleep. These are tools that carry into every moment of life. Eventually, the fear of the night fades. You no longer dread restlessness. You welcome it. You treat it as extra time to wake up. And this changes everything. You stop seeing wakefulness as failure. You stop counting hours. You stop needing the night to go a certain way. And in that surrender, both body and mind begin to rest more easily, because nothing is being demanded of them. This way of being moves beyond night. You start to bring the same attitude to discomfort during the day. You stop needing things to change for you to feel okay. You stop fighting what is. You meet each moment with the same silent awareness you met the night with. And this is liberation. In Buddhism, sleep is not seen as a break from practice. It's seen as part of the path. How you meet the moments before sleep and the ones when sleep doesn't come shapes your training. It shows how well you've learned to sit with what's real. It reveals your relationship to control, to effort, to surrender. And in the still hours of the night, when no one is watching, your practice becomes real. No applause, no achievement, just breath, just presence, just you and the mind, learning to be together without conflict. So the next time sleep stays away, don't fight, don't beg. Sit up, breathe, feel. Enter the sacredness of the moment. Let the silence of night become your temple. Let the stillness of now become your teacher. And when the night no longer threatens peace, when even sleeplessness has become a doorway to presence, a new awareness begins to grow. A subtle realization that silence itself is not just still. It vibrates. It hums with something deeper than quiet. It has tone, texture, rhythm, not in the way the ears hear, but in the way awareness feels. There is a frequency to emptiness, and tuning the mind to it is not metaphor. It is medicine. A way of softening internal noise not by shutting it down, but by aligning with something that already lives beneath it. A field of stillness that doesn't push thoughts away, but dissolves their hold simply by being more constant than they are. This shift begins when silence is no longer treated as absence, when it is no longer something between words, but something with its own presence. The moment you stop listening only for sound and start sensing the space itself, something in the nervous system responds. The body loosens, the breath lengthens, the emotions untangle. Because they are no longer reacting to thought, they are syncing to a different signal entirely, one that doesn't shout, one that doesn't demand, one that simply is. Buddhist practice points here again and again. The concept of shunyata, or emptiness, is not a void to fear, it is a resonance to enter. It is not lifeless, it is alive in the purest sense, empty of ego, yes, but full of clarity. And this clarity, when tuned into, begins to clear out what was never needed. The mental loops, the emotional tension, the unspoken stress that builds when the mind is tuned only to the surface. Silence resets not because it fixes anything, but because it brings the whole system back into harmony. This frequency of emptiness can be felt most clearly when the mind is quiet but alert. In meditation, in nature, in long periods of intentional stillness, this tone becomes perceptible, not as sound, but as depth, as a kind of low hum of peace. It doesn't announce itself, it doesn't ask for attention. It simply becomes more obvious the less you interfere. And the more you rest into it, the more you begin to feel that your thoughts are not the default. They are the interruption. The mind wants to attach to this feeling. It wants to define it. But it can't. The moment you try to grasp it, it slips. This is why silence teaches by presence. It cannot be described. It can only be entered. The way a singer tunes to a pitch without naming it. The way a dancer moves to music without thinking about the notes. This kind of tuning is instinctual, but it must be remembered. You remember by doing less, by letting awareness rest in the body, by not chasing sensation, but letting it arrive, by staying with the pause between the inhale and the exhale, by noticing the space before a thought forms and after it dissolves. These are not gaps to fill, they are thresholds. And when the mind stops leaping across them, it begins to settle into them. It begins to feel their texture. The texture of silence is not flat, it is layered. It shifts depending on your depth of presence. On the days when the mind is chaotic, the silence feels distant. But the more you sit with it, the more it begins to rise. And with that rising, the noise begins to soften, not because you fought it, but because it was never as real as the stillness beneath it. This frequency can be accessed anywhere. You don't need a mountain. You need attention. Full attention. Soft attention. The kind that doesn't grasp. The kind that rests without falling asleep. The more you bring your awareness to the silence, the more the silence begins to bring its rhythm into you. It's not an effort, it's a tuning, like placing a bowl in water and letting it float. The bowl does not need to move, the water carries it. Some monastics speak of silence as a kind of inner bell, one that rings beneath thought, one that always vibrates with clarity, regardless of what the mind is doing on the surface. You cannot force this bell to sound louder, but you can become still enough to hear it. When emotional overwhelm strikes, this practice becomes essential. The common reaction is to fight the emotion, to analyze it, to fix it. But Buddhist silence offers another approach. Don't fix, don't name, don't suppress. Tune to the stillness, not to make the emotion disappear, but to let it rest in something larger than itself. Overwhelm grows when emotions feel like everything, when they fill the whole field of awareness. But when the mind is trained to feel the background silence, that emotional field shrinks. It doesn't vanish, it becomes part of a larger landscape, and in that larger space, it becomes bearable, breathable, movable. Mental chatter responds the same way. When the mind spins stories, they feel urgent. But if you bring attention not to the story, but to the silence beneath it, the urgency fades. Not by resisting the thought, but by placing it in context. The silence reminds you, this is just one wave in an ocean. You are not the wave. You are the space the wave rises in. Practicing this tuning throughout the day can change the whole way you live. In a noisy room, find the silence between voices. In a tense conversation, feel the stillness beneath the emotion. In a crowded mind, return to the breath and then to the space around the breath. Each time you do this, you are tuning. You are moving your awareness from the surface to the source. Eventually, you will find that even in chaos, the frequency of silence remains stable. Even in pain, the vibration is untouched. And that tuning becomes not just a practice, but a refuge. A place you return to. A home that cannot be shaken. Not because the world is quiet, but because you are tuned to something deeper. Some people experience this frequency as lightness, others as warmth. Some describe it as emptiness that feels full. Words fail, but the experience remains. What matters is not how you describe it, but how often you return to it. The more you do, the more it recalibrates your nervous system. The more it becomes your default signal, the less control the external noise has over you. You stop reacting from habit. You start responding from clarity. You no longer seek peace in the world. You bring peace into it, not by effort, but by frequency, by resonance, by being aligned with the silence that holds all things. In this state, silence becomes your teacher, your anchor, your medicine. You no longer need to escape the noise. You just stop tuning into it. You no longer need to argue with the mind. You just let it play in the distance while you stay rooted in the soundless tone of presence. And now, as the mind grows quieter and your awareness becomes more attuned, something gentle emerges. Not just peace, but joy. A quiet joy that doesn't need to be shown. A smile that doesn't come from what's happening, but from what isn't. A joy that lives beyond expression, that moves in silence, that does not need to be shared, to be felt fully. And once the mind begins to match the frequency of silence, once presence becomes a resting place rather than a goal, something else starts to rise. Not a thought, not a feeling, but a kind of inner brightness that asks for nothing. Not attention, not confirmation, not approval. It just glows quietly from within, like light through paper. It doesn't need to be seen to be real. This is the silent smile, a joy so subtle It doesn't demand expression. A joy that doesn't speak, but says everything. Buddhist teachings don't describe joy as a peak or a performance. They speak of it as a steady inner flame, a smile that exists in the heart, not on the face. A smile that's not waiting for a reason. This kind of joy doesn't come from entertainment or praise or success. It comes from stillness itself, from the simple, sustained awareness that life is here, now, and that nothing more is required. The silent smile is not a mask. It's not worn to please others. It's not forced in moments of discomfort. It is the natural byproduct of presence. When the mind is no longer trying to win or run or compare, joy begins to surface, not as celebration, but as stillness that has softened into warmth. In Buddhist tradition, this joy is sometimes described as mudita, sympathetic joy. The kind of happiness that rises not from personal gain, but from connection, from the success, peace, or freedom of others. But it also refers to joy that arises for no outer reason at all, a joy that comes from being aligned with what is true, no matter what is happening. This inner joy needs no words. In fact, speaking about it often pulls the mind out of it. The moment you try to describe it, the experience can dissolve. It's too light to hold in sentences, too whole to split into parts. So it expresses itself in silence, in the softening of your shoulders, in the way you sit, in the tone of your breath, in the space between everything you say and everything you choose not to say. This kind of joy has no spike. It has no crash, because it does not depend on outcome. It's not based on things going your way. It's rooted in being okay with the way things already are. And the deeper you go into this state, the more you realize how little is needed to access it. A single breath, a still moment, a quiet return to presence. You might begin to notice this joy rising in odd moments, after a long pause, while looking at something ordinary, during the quiet after a deep exhale. It's not flashy, it doesn't shout, it hums. It flows beneath the surface like calm water. You don't chase it, you let it carry you. This is where the practice begins, not with adding more joy, but with removing the reasons why it can't rise, the thoughts that say, "I'll feel peace when," the habits that tie happiness to conditions, the mind's belief that joy must be earned or explained. When these soften, joy appears on its own, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make the corners of your mouth lift, even when no one's around. That lift doesn't have to be visible. Sometimes the smile lives entirely in the body, in the breath, in the sense that nothing is missing, even when things are hard. This doesn't mean you avoid pain. It means pain no longer blocks access to joy. Both can exist in the same space. Stillness makes room for both. Buddhist monks are often seen with a slight smile, even in silence. This is not performance. It's alignment. Their smile is not from a joke or a thought. It's from the quiet joy of not needing anything else. They are not trying to impress. They are not trying to look peaceful. They have simply dropped what is not true, and what remains is joy without a story. You can feel this in people who carry deep stillness. Their joy doesn't try to convince. It just exists. And being around them feels like being near a warm sun, not because they radiate emotion, but because they are deeply at ease. This kind of presence is contagious. It doesn't need to speak. It doesn't need to comfort. It just is. And that being gives others permission to drop into their own quiet joy. To practice this silent smile, start not with your mouth, but with your breath. Let the breath slow. Let it deepen. Let your awareness rest in it without needing to change anything. As you settle, feel the corners of your eyes soften. Let your jaw unclench. Notice any subtle holding in the body and release it. Then simply sit without a goal and notice if something light begins to stir. Don't name it. Don't ask if it's real. Let it grow on its own. If the mind begins to judge, let that thought pass like wind. Return to the stillness. Return to the breath. This kind of joy cannot be forced, but it can be allowed. You may find that this joy comes more easily when you are alone, when no one is expecting you to speak, when no one is watching. This doesn't mean joy is antisocial. It means joy is most natural when it's not being performed. And the more you practice feeling joy without expression, the easier it becomes to carry that joy with you into every part of life. You can smile silently in a crowded street, during a task you've done 1,000 times, while waiting in line, while walking in the dark. Not because anything special is happening, but because your presence is strong, your awareness is steady, and in that steadiness, joy has room to rise. This joy is not weak. It is not fragile. It is what remains when everything else is stripped away. It does not crumble under pressure. It does not disappear in difficulty, because it does not depend on things going well. It arises from being fully alive, from not resisting this moment, from not needing the world to be different in order to feel peace. Silent joy does not mean hiding. It means not needing to display. It means not trading happiness for recognition. It means living from an inner well that doesn't run dry just because the outer world isn't clapping. This practice becomes a kind of secret strength, a way of walking through the world with lightness, of carrying peace through noise, of moving without leaving stillness behind. And as you deepen this practice, you begin to recognize this same joy in others, not always on their faces, but in their presence, in their stillness, in the way they listen, in the way they breathe. The more you tune into this, the more you realize that joy is not rare. It's just buried, under thoughts, under pressure, under the noise of needing to be someone. But when that noise fades, joy returns. Not as a reward, but as your natural state. This is the joy that doesn't ask to be known, that doesn't rise to impress, that doesn't wait to be shared. It lives in silence, it lives in stillness, and it is yours, always. And when joy no longer depends on words, when it begins to rise quietly from within, untouched by conditions or applause, something even deeper is revealed. A truth most people avoid, a truth harder than silence, but more freeing than any joy alone. That suffering, too, can be met in silence, not because it's easy, not because silence makes it disappear in an instant, but because silence, when held without resistance, does something extraordinary. It becomes the softest place pain has ever touched, not to escape it, but to dissolve its sharpness without argument. This is how silence becomes an answer to suffering. In Buddhist practice, Pain is never treated as the enemy. It is not pushed away. It is not suppressed. It is not drowned out with distractions or masked with forced positivity. It is met completely, but not with stories, not with mental battles. It is met with full awareness. And in that awareness, silence becomes a kind of container, a field where pain can finally unfold, breathe and soften, not because someone explains it away, but because nothing is trying to change it. Most people fear silence in the face of suffering because they think silence means absence, a lack of care, a lack of answers. But true Buddhist silence is the opposite. It is the purest form of attention. It says, I am here with this pain, and I do not need it to vanish to remain here. That presence, without pressure, begins to shift everything. When suffering is narrated, it often deepens. The mind adds weight, identity, meaning. It says, this always happens to me, or I shouldn't feel this way. These thoughts grow like vines around the original pain, tightening until there is no space to breathe. Silence cuts those vines, not by force, but by refusal to feed them. It doesn't argue, it doesn't explain, it stays. And in that staying, pain loses its grip. This approach takes courage. The mind will try to resist. It will want to speak the pain aloud, to wrap it in story, to make it louder so that it feels real. But Buddhist silence invites a different path, to sit with the raw sensation without story, to breathe into the discomfort without labeling it as good or bad, to allow the body to feel what it feels without commentary from the mind. In this practice, suffering becomes a teacher. It reveals where the body holds fear, where the heart has tightened, where the past is still alive inside the breath. Silence makes room for all of it, not to be fixed, but to be known, truly known, not intellectually, but somatically. And once known without resistance, suffering begins to move. This movement is not dramatic. It is slow, gentle, the way ice melts under steady warmth. The pain doesn't shout. It sighs. It softens. Not because the cause has changed, but because the mind has stopped resisting what is already here. Silence also protects the nervous system during suffering. When words are forced during moments of deep pain, the body can brace, react, shut down. But silence allows for integration. It allows emotions to flow in their own time without being dissected. It invites the breath to slow, the shoulders to release. It creates space where trauma can begin to unfreeze, not because it's being analyzed, but because it's being held with non-judging presence. This is why Buddhist teachers often respond to suffering with pauses, with presence, with stillness. Not because they don't care, but because they understand that words can sometimes cause more harm than good. That a single breath shared in silence can offer more comfort than 1,000 sentences ever could. Silence honors the complexity of suffering. It refuses to reduce it. It listens without needing to fix. You can practice this in your own life by learning to meet discomfort without commentary. When sadness arises, sit with it. Let it expand. Let the breath meet it. Say nothing. When grief tightens the chest, stay with the body. Not with explanation, but with presence. You are not ignoring the pain. You are refusing to abandon it. You are becoming the calm witness that pain never had. And in that witnessing, something ancient begins to unwind. The pain, that was once too sharp to touch starts to become feelable, livable, and in time it begins to change, not because it was pushed away, but because it was allowed to breathe. This kind of healing doesn't depend on solving. It depends on staying, on being the silence that surrounds the pain instead of the noise that tries to escape it. That surrounding becomes medicine. A field of peace where suffering no longer has to scream to be heard. And sometimes, silence becomes the only thing that suffering will trust. When words have failed, when explanations have collapsed, when nothing makes sense, silence is still there, unmoving, unshaken, not passive, but deeply engaged. It says, you do not have to be fixed to be held. This holding creates transformation, not through logic, not through advice, but through surrender. The moment you stop fighting the pain, the moment you let it sit beside you without being shoved away, the mind begins to rest. The body begins to trust. The emotion begins to release. You begin to learn how to cry in silence, how to tremble in peace, how to feel your own breaking and still remain whole. This is the secret most people never learn. Suffering does not need to be avoided to be healed. It only needs to be allowed. And the more you practice this, the more you can hold others in their suffering too, without rushing to comfort, without trying to explain it away, just by being there, quietly, breathing with them, holding the silence that allows their pain to unfold without fear. This is what true compassion looks like, not fixing, not pleasing, but being the presence that doesn't flinch, the silence that doesn't back away, the calm that says, you are not alone and you don't have to hide. And slowly, this changes the way suffering lives in the body. It no longer hides, it no longer hardens. It becomes a wave that moves through rather than a weight that stays stuck. Silence gives it permission to leave when it's ready, not because it was pushed out, but because it was fully welcomed. In Zen, there is a saying, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. This doesn't mean that pain isn't real. It means that the added suffering, the story, the resistance, the avoidance, is what silence can remove. What's left is just sensation, just feeling. And that feeling, when met without fear, can be carried. You can practice this each time you're overwhelmed. When fear rises, instead of thinking through it, breathe. Sit still. Let silence wrap around it. Notice where it lives in your body. Stay there. No story. Just presence. When sadness returns, don't rush to talk it away. Let it soak in silence. Let it speak not through words, but through tears, through breath, through release. Each time you do this, you train the mind to meet pain with clarity. You stop turning discomfort into identity. You stop confusing emotion with truth. You become the witness, not distant, but calm, not detached, but rooted. And over time, silence becomes your first response to pain, not because you have nothing to say, but because you've learned that words are not always the answer. Sometimes, being fully present is. Sometimes, the most powerful support is saying nothing, doing nothing, just sitting with what is until it changes shape on its own. This is not spiritual bypass. This is spiritual strength, the willingness to be with the full range of life without trying to escape, the strength to sit in the fire without rushing to cool it, the discipline to trust that pain, when met with love and stillness, eventually softens. And now, having learned how to meet suffering with silence, we enter an even more mysterious teaching. One that speaks not just to the mind, but to time itself. Because in silence, time begins to shift. The future fades. The past loses its weight. And what remains is something eternal. A moment that holds all others. A now that heals not because it lasts, but because it never ends. And when silence becomes strong enough to hold suffering without fear, when pain is no longer rushed or reshaped, but simply witnessed, the mind begins to soften even further. The stories weaken, the identity fades, and then something even deeper begins to dissolve. The clock. Not the ticking of seconds, but the internal pressure of time itself. The grip of the past, the weight of the future, the constant pull to be somewhere else. Silence begins to undo all of it. And in that undoing, something rare and healing unfolds, the direct experience of the eternal present. Buddhist practice speaks often about time, but not in hours or years. It points to how the mind creates time, how it holds on to the past and worries about the future. This creation is not neutral. It shapes suffering. It turns pain into identity and turns goals into pressure. The mind spends most of its energy not here but elsewhere, regretting what was, anticipating what might be, missing what is. Silence interrupts that loop, not with force, but with presence. When the mind quiets and the body becomes still, time begins to collapse, not disappear completely, but lose its grip. The past no longer repeats. The future no longer looms. Awareness begins to settle into what is actually here. This breath, this sound, this sensation, nothing more. This is not theory. It is something you can feel in your own practice. When you sit in silence long enough, there's a shift. Minutes blur. Expectations fade. The mind stops counting. You lose track of how long you've been sitting, not because you're distracted, but because attention is no longer moving forward or backward. It's resting fully in the now, and that now is different from the usual present. It is not a tiny sliver between what has been and what will be. It is a space that stretches, a depth that widens, a dimension of being that is not bound by before or after. The longer you stay in it, the more healing happens, because nothing is chasing you, nothing is missing, nothing is next. Stillness is the doorway to this kind of time. Not measured time, but living time. Timeless presence. A state where the heart stops racing ahead and the mind stops reviewing what cannot be changed. In this space, the nervous system calms because it no longer senses threat in the unseen. It no longer loops in unfinished stories. It no longer believes in the urgency of elsewhere. This kind of presence cannot be forced, but it can be invited by returning to the breath, by softening the body, by letting go of what just happened, by refusing to chase what hasn't happened yet. Each time you return, the present moment reveals itself again, not in words, but in silence, in the space where awareness meets life directly. Time is often the hidden cause of anxiety, the feeling of not having enough, the pressure to get somewhere, the guilt of not being where you thought you'd be. These are all time-based stories. Silence dissolves them by dissolving the storyteller. In stillness, those thoughts may arise, but they are not fed. They float and they vanish. Monastics train in this over years, learning how to stay rooted in the now even while moving through the day. It is not about ignoring the calendar, it's about living from presence, not pressure. Doing what's needed without being enslaved to a timeline that demands something else. They don't rush through now to get to later. They bring later into now, or they let it wait. This presence is possible in daily life too. You don't need a monastery to feel it. You only need to practice slowing down, sitting without a clock, eating without distraction, walking without destination, breathing without waiting for the next thing. These acts are not lazy, they are revolutionary. They reclaim the mind from time's illusion. The illusion of time is seductive because it feels like responsibility, planning, progress. But in truth, most of what the mind calls time is repetition of thought, and most of that thought is unnecessary. Silence breaks this pattern by becoming more real than the thoughts themselves. And when that happens, something shifts in how you experience life. You begin to feel time as movement, not measurement, as cycles, not lines. You notice how seasons rise and fall, how breath returns and returns, how the sun moves without being rushed. You become part of that rhythm, not by calculation, but by surrender. This is why Buddhist rituals emphasize repetition, bells, breathing, not because they are magical, but because they anchor the mind in rhythm, not in urgency. They train awareness to feel the shape of the moment, not the demand of the hour. And from that shape, clarity arises. You begin to know what to do, not because a plan tells you, but because presence shows you. This does not mean giving up structure. It means not being trapped by it. It means using time when needed, but never being owned by it. And in that freedom, rest becomes easier. Choices become clearer. Peace becomes available even in movement. You begin to walk more slowly. Not because you're lazy, but because you're aware. You begin to speak with more pauses. Not because you don't know what to say, but because you're not rushing to be understood. You begin to listen without waiting to respond, and in that stillness, connection deepens, not just with others, but with yourself. This is where healing begins, because the mind cannot heal when it is running forward or backward. It can only heal when it rests in the now. Silence makes that rest possible, not by solving the past, not by securing the future, but by opening fully to what is already here. The body breathes, the heart beats, the world turns. That is enough. And in this space, you begin to see clearly. The regrets that seemed heavy begin to fade. Not because they were resolved, but because they were no longer being repeated. The worries that once felt urgent begin to loosen. Not because the future changed, but because you stopped trying to control it. This clarity doesn't remove all difficulty, but it removes the extra weight. It lets you meet each challenge from now, not from the story of how long it's lasted or how long it might last. This moment becomes the only ground you need to stand on, and in that ground you become unshakable. The silence of now doesn't speak, but it teaches. It shows you how much energy was spent outside of life, how much attention was pulled away from what matters, and It invites you back, again and again, not as punishment, but as refuge. It is always here. It never leaves. Only the mind wanders. You may begin to feel that time isn't something to manage, but something to release. Not entirely, just enough to return to the rhythm underneath it all. The timeless current that runs through every breath, every moment, every movement. When you live from that current, stress cannot hold you. Regret cannot bind you. Fear cannot find you. And when time dissolves, when the present becomes more than just a moment, when it becomes your natural state, you begin to feel something else shift beneath the surface. A kind of lightness, not just of thought, but of presence. Because now there's less noise inside you. And with that quiet, something unexpected happens. You become less noticeable to the noise around you. Not because you disappear, but because you stop radiating the tension that attracts it. This is what it means to become invisible, not in body, but in energy. A silence so clear it protects you without a wall. A presence so inward, chaos can't grip it. This is how monks preserve their life force, by withdrawing not from life, but from unnecessary entanglement. The modern world drains people, not just through tasks, but through conversations that never needed to happen, arguments that lead nowhere, and endless reactions that serve no one. The energy lost in defending, proving, pleasing, and correcting is rarely noticed until exhaustion sets in. But monks knew this well. They practiced silence not only as a spiritual path, but as an energetic shield. Each word they withheld, each explanation they didn't offer, conserved power. That power wasn't just for meditation, it was for life, for clarity, for movement without waste. The body knows when energy is being spent uselessly. You feel it after interactions that left you empty, after sharing too much, after explaining what never needed to be said. This is karmic clutter, old patterns that pull you into reaction out of habit. Silence breaks those loops, not by running, but by removing the fuel. When speech is withdrawn intentionally, the hooks can't land, the bait isn't taken, and what might have turned into emotional chaos dissolves before it begins. Protecting your energy doesn't mean becoming cold. It means becoming selective. It means knowing that not every truth needs to be said, not every opinion needs to be shared, not every conflict needs your attention. Silence creates space between you and the world's demands. In that space, you choose, and choice is where power lives. Monastics often take vows of noble silence for this reason. In that vow, they are not forbidden to speak. They are freed from speaking unnecessarily. The mouth is no longer an automatic outlet for every impulse. The tongue becomes still. The eyes do more listening. The mind stops preparing responses, and the energy that was once spent managing perception is redirected inward. Strength returns. Focus sharpens. The body feels less fragmented. In daily life, this can be practiced in subtle ways, not replying to things that don't need a response. Letting silence stretch in a conversation rather than filling it with nervous words. Choosing presence over performance. Speaking only when words serve peace, not ego. These choices are not antisocial, they are mature. They protect the sacred rhythm of your attention. Every time you explain yourself unnecessarily, You offer a piece of energy that may not return. Every time you defend a position that doesn't need defending, you give away more than words. You give away peace. Silence says, I will not argue for my existence. I will not justify my stillness. I will not trade my calm for approval. And in that stance, you become invisible, not absent, but unreachable by drama. This invisibility is not isolation. It is a form of inner privacy, the kind that doesn't hide, but holds. You walk through the world without leaking energy. You sit in rooms without needing to prove yourself. You move through conflict without being pulled into its orbit. People begin to feel this. They speak differently around you, not because you silence them, but because your silence is clear. It creates a field, one where noise loses its appetite. In this field, your energy collects. It no longer escapes through gossip, through overthinking, through reaction. It pools inward. That reservoir builds not just peace, but power. The kind of power that doesn't need to dominate. The kind that rests quietly in the spine, in the breath, in the gaze. And that power can now be directed, not scattered. Monks use this energy to deepen their practice, to move with intention, to serve without burning out. You can use it the same way, not to withdraw from life, but to enter it without losing yourself. When silence becomes your default, not just externally, but internally, you begin to see clearly what is worth your attention and what is not. This clarity prevents karmic entanglement. Karmic energy accumulates when you keep responding to things that don't belong to you, when you engage with people who only want reaction, when you let your mind get pulled into arguments you never started. Each time you say less, you protect yourself. Each time you do not speak from impulse, you return to your center. And from that center, life becomes simpler, not easier, but more aligned. You start to act only when needed, speak only when true, rest when tired, move when called. There's no more noise between you and your knowing. That knowing is silent, and the more you trust it, the less you need outside noise to validate it. This is not about shrinking. It's about refining. You don't lose expression, you gain precision. You don't shut down feeling, you learn which feelings belong to you. You stop broadcasting your thoughts to be understood. Instead, you let your presence speak. Let your calm make the loudest statement in the room. People may not always understand this silence. Some may misread it. That's okay. The practice is not about being liked, it's about being whole. And once wholeness becomes your home, misunderstanding can't reach it. You stop translating yourself for people who aren't listening. You stop proving your worth in conversations that cannot see it. You stop offering explanations that only drain you. You carry silence like a cloak, not to hide, but to protect. You walk through crowds untouched, not because you're absent, but because your presence is no longer scattered. Your energy stays with you, and that presence begins to nourish you, even in noise. You don't need the world to be quiet for you to stay calm. You've made calm your default setting, your true resting place. And from that place, you offer others something rare. Not your performance, not your opinion, not your energy, but your grounded presence. You become the person others feel safe around without knowing why. You become the quiet one whose energy speaks louder than words ever could. You become the anchor in rooms filled with wind. This is the gift of becoming invisible. Not to disappear, but to remain whole in a world that pulls in every direction. Not to avoid life, but to meet it without losing your rhythm. Not to reject people, but to stop giving them what they never needed to know. After hours of walking side by side with silence, through chaos, clarity, stillness, suffering, and sacred joy, one thing becomes undeniable. Silence was never empty. It was full of answers. It didn't run from pain, it held it. It didn't just quiet the noise, it rewired the mind. It didn't ask for attention, it gave you back your own. Through the wisdom of Buddhist teachings, silence became the unseen medicine, the hidden teacher, the space where healing could finally begin, not because words were said, but because the need to say them dissolved. Each subtopic whispered a different lesson. That stillness is not escape, it's resistance. That the unsaid can protect more than any argument. That presence is the real miracle. That joy doesn't need to be shared to be real. That peace doesn't live in the future, it lives in this exact breath. And when you stopped trying to explain yourself to the world, you began to meet the self that didn't need defending. So, if something softened inside you tonight, if silence made space where noise once lived, let it stay. Let it grow. Let it reshape how you move through tomorrow. If this journey spoke to something deeper in you, leave a comment below with, "Silence is now my teacher." Let the world know you're walking a different path now, one with fewer words and more wisdom. And if you haven't already, subscribe and tap the bell. This channel is a quiet space in a loud world, and we're just getting started. See you in the silence.